captain in the United States Army received an order. The order was legal. His commanding officers expected it to be followed without question, without delay, and without the kind of thinking that slows soldiers down. He read it. He set it down. And then he told his men they were leaving, not transferring, not requesting reassignment. Leaving, walking away from the government that had given them their ranks, their weapons, their purpose, and every structure they had ever operated inside. One order, one refusal, one moment in a facility buried beneath the California desert in the autumn of 2077. That moment is where the Brotherhood of Steel begins, not with a ceremony, not with a vision or a founding document or a general's carefully worded declaration. With a refusal. Share everything the order built across the next 2.5 centuries, every bunker it defended, every war it fought, every fracture it survived, grew from that single act of a unit that looked at what it had been asked to do and decided collectively that it would not. Welcome. If you are settling in for the night, you have found the right place. If this kind of storytelling helps you sleep, consider subscribing so you never miss a new chapter, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Now, back to the beginning. By 2077, the United States had been at war in one form or another for 25 years. The resource wars had reshaped the world's political geography through a simple and brutal logic. Nations that needed oil took it from nations that had it, Saijishi, and the organizations built to prevent that kind of taking had collapsed under the weight of too many competing interests. What remained was a country that had grown enormous in its military capability and considerably smaller in its willingness to ask whether that capability was being used correctly. The army that existed inside this country was extraordinary in its equipment and increasingly difficult to question in its conduct. Defense contracts worth more than most nations had flowed to private corporations for years, and the programs those contracts funded were not always the kind that appeared in public budget summaries. Some of them operated in facilities that did not appear on standard maps. Some of them did things that the legal frameworks governing military research had not been written to cover, because the people who wrote those frameworks had not anticipated a government willing to move this far past them. Mariposa Military Base was one of those facilities, and what was happening inside it was the reason that everything that followed happened the way it did. The unit transferred to Mariposa in the autumn of 2077 arrived expecting a standard posting. What the records inside the facility described was not standard. A biological research program funded through military channels, operated by scientists under Army contract, running for years in the facility's lower levels, had been testing a modified virus on human subjects. The virus, designated FEV in the program's documentation, was designed to alter human physical structure in ways that natural development never could. The Army's interest in what it might produce was the kind that came with unlimited funding and no public oversight. The subjects being used to test it were not volunteers. The intake records did not describe them as soldiers, or prisoners offered reduced sentences, or individuals who had consented to participation in any meaningful sense. They had been brought to the facility and placed in the program because the program needed them, and the people running it had decided that was sufficient reason. The documentation covering this was filed with the same administrative language used for equipment requisitions and supply orders. The scientists who wrote those files had been doing so for years. The chain of authorization above them extended high enough into the government structure that the program had never once been interrupted by a question it was required to answer. The soldiers assigned to guard Mariposa had known what was happening below them. The air in the lower corridors carried a particular stillness, the kind that collects in spaces where things are done that are not spoken about afterward. Most of those soldiers had continued their postings without formal objection, because that was what the structure they operated inside required of them, and because the structure had never before given them a reason to believe that refusing it was an available option. That changed when the new commanding officer reviewed the files. The communication sent to higher command was precise and professional, a formal request for clarification regarding the legal and ethical basis of what the facility was conducting. It was not a threat. It was not a declaration. It was a question submitted through the correct channels from an officer who had spent his career doing things the correct way and expected the system to function accordingly. The response instructed him to continue the mission as assigned. What happened in the days after that response arrived was not impulsive. The unit discussed it. The soldiers who had been stationed at Mariposa longest were part of those discussions, and what they described of the program's operation, the details that had not made it into the formal records, and the things witnessed rather than documented, filled in the spaces between the clinical language of the research files. The conversations were long and uncomfortable in the way that conversations are when the people having them are trying to determine how far outside everything they were trained to do they are willing to go. At the end of those conversations, orders were given. The scientists running the program were detained. A tribunal was assembled inside the facility, carrying no legal standing under any code the Army recognized, but conducted with the complete gravity of a proceeding that intended its conclusions to be real. The evidence was presented. The scientists were given the opportunity to respond. The tribunal reached its findings. To the soldiers who carried out what followed, did so in the formal manner of people executing a decision that had been reached through a process, not an eruption. Several of the scientists responsible for what had been done in those lower levels were executed. The decision that had been made was not a simple one, and the people who made it understood that. What they had done had no precedent in the military. Either of them had served inside. There was no regulation covering it, no commanding officer who had sanctioned it, no legal framework that would have recognized it as anything other than a serious breach of military conduct. They had looked at that and decided it was the less significant problem. The weight of that decision settled into the facility the way that significant decisions do, not loudly, but completely, she occupying every room and corridor until it was simply the atmosphere of the place. On October 20th, 1977, a transmission went out on military frequencies from Mariposa Military Base. The message was direct. The unit stationed at the facility was formally withdrawing from the service of the United States of America. The reasons were stated without elaboration. The transmission was sent, received by whoever was still monitoring those bands, and entered into whatever records were still being maintained at that point in the government's operation. 3 days later, on October 23rd, 2077, the missiles were launched. The exchange that followed lasted approximately 2 hours. What it left behind was a continent transformed beyond the recognition of anyone who had lived on it before. Cities reduced to rubble and radiation, to infrastructure that had connected the country's systems dissolved in the same hours that the systems themselves stopped functioning. A government that had authorized the Mariposa program and told the unit there to continue its mission ending before the day was over. The unit that had already left that government survived because they were below ground when it ended. The facility's reinforced levels absorbed the distant pressure of detonations without collapsing. When the shaking stopped and the sensors showed what the surface had become, the group inside understood that the world they had formerly separated themselves from 3 days earlier no longer existed in any form worth separating from. The silence on every military frequency was total. It did not change in the hours that followed, or the days. What had been a communication network connecting thousands of military installations across the continent was simply gone. Not damaged, not disrupted, gone. And the static that replaced it was the sound of an absence so complete it had its own texture. Survivors began reaching Mariposa within the first weeks. They came from the surrounding area in small groups, people who had been far enough from impact zones to outlast the initial exchange, close enough to the facility's location to find it before exposure or exhaustion made the journey irrelevant. They were absorbed. Resources were assessed and allocated. A structure of daily responsibility was established. The chain of command that had walked away from the United States Army remained the organizing principle of this growing community, because it was the structure available, and because the people inside it were trained to function within one. The facility itself could not be the permanent answer. The research materials in its lower levels were a contamination problem that compounded with time. Its position in open desert left it exposed in ways that would become more dangerous as the wasteland outside settled into whatever it was becoming. A pre-war government bunker at a location called Lost Hills in Central California had been identified as a more viable base, larger, provisioned for extended occupation, built with the depth that long-term habitation required. The march to Lost Hills began without ceremony. The ground between the two locations had been altered by the exchange in ways that made every mile uncertain. Radiation varied without visible pattern. What looked like passable terrain on one stretch became dangerous on the next without warning. Survivors encountered along the route ranged from people seeking to join the group to people who had assessed the situation and decided that taking from organized groups was more efficient than building alongside them. The unit's weapons and training shaped those encounters. Not all of them ended without cost to the group making the march. Several members of the unit did not reach Lost Hills. The ones who did found the bunker waiting, sealed, intact, provisioned by planners who had anticipated exactly this kind of extended emergency and stocked accordingly. The doors were heavy and deep. The interior was large enough to house everyone who had arrived, with room for the growth that was already underway. The facility closed around them. Outside, what had been California settled into a quiet that the landscape had not known for generations. The fires that had burned in the distance during the first days of the march had reduced themselves to something lower and steadier. The night above the desert was different than it had been before the war. Every city that had filled it with ambient light was dark, and the sky above was the sky that had always existed behind that brightness, visible now in the way it had not been for a century. The group that had walked from Mariposa to Lost Hills did not yet have a name. What they had was a bunker, a chain of command, a set of weapons maintained with the discipline of professional soldiers, and the shared knowledge of what they had done at the facility they had left behind. The decision that had separated them from the government 3 days before the government ended. The tribunal that had reached its conclusions inside a room no legal authority had sanctioned. The transmission that had gone out on October 20th into a world that had 3 days left to receive it. They had not built a philosophy yet. They had not written a code or established a hierarchy beyond the one they had carried with them. They had not decided what they were for, or what they believed, or what they intended to become in the years ahead. What they had decided, the only thing at that point that defined them as something distinct from any other armed group of survivors, was what they were not willing to do. That distinction was the foundation. Everything built on top of it came later, slowly, across years, and then decades, and then generations, that would inherit the consequences of one unit's refusal without ever having stood in the room where the refusal was made. The Brotherhood of Steel did not have its name yet, but it existed. It had walked through the ruins of the old world to arrive at a place it intended to hold. And the long work of becoming something, of turning a refusal into an institution, a moment into a century, a decision into a doctrine that would outlast everyone who made it, was about to begin. Lost Hills had been built by people who believed the worst was coming and wanted to be ready for it. The pre-war government had constructed the bunker across multiple reinforced levels, each one deeper and more protected than the last, with ventilation systems designed to filter irradiated air for years without maintenance, supply reserves calculated for extended occupation, and structural walls thick enough that the ground above them could change completely, without disturbing what was stored below. The planners who designed it had been correct about the worst coming. They had not survived to see their preparations used. The group that moved into Lost Hills in the weeks after the march from Mariposa did so level by level, clearing each section before advancing to the next, checking structural integrity, assessing what the pre-war stockpiles actually contained, determining what was functional and what the decades of SEAL storage had degraded beyond use. The process was methodical because the people conducting it were trained to be methodical, and because the alternative to careful assessment was discovering a critical failure at the worst possible moment. Every room was documented, every supply cache was catalogued, every system was tested against what the facility's technical manuals said it should do. The ventilation worked, the water recycling worked. The power systems, drawing from a pre-war generator that had been running on minimal load during the years the bunker sat empty, worked. Lost Hills was intact in the ways that mattered most, and the group settling into it understood over the first days of that process that they had found something genuinely rare in the landscape the bombs had created, a place that could sustain them. The cold of the lower levels was constant regardless of the season above. Sound moved differently underground than it did on the surface. Voices carried further in the corridors than people expected, and the particular silence between sounds was a different quality of silence than anything the open air produced. The first year inside Lost Hills was defined by the work of survival rather than the work of building anything beyond it. Children had been born during the march, and in the weeks immediately following arrival, the continuation of biological processes that do not pause for catastrophe. The facility's medical resources were sufficient for basic care, but not for complications. And the first deaths recorded in the Brotherhood's early documentation were partly the deaths of people whose injuries or radiation exposure from the march had progressed beyond what the available supplies could address. Those losses were recorded with the same careful notation used for equipment assessments. The record-keeping was not cold. It was the practice of people who understood that documentation was how a group remembered what it had been through, and that memory of that kind was a form of survival too. Food was rationed according to a system established in the first weeks. Watch rotations were assigned and maintained with the consistency of a unit that had not stopped being a unit simply because the military it belonged to no longer existed. A schedule emerged, not imposed by a single directive, but developed through the practical requirements of managing a growing community in an enclosed space where unstructured time created friction, and friction created problems that the group could not afford. The surface above remained hostile through that first year in ways that instruments confirmed and occasional brief scouting expeditions reinforced. The radiation levels across the California landscape were not uniformly lethal. Some areas had already begun to drop toward ranges that protective equipment could manage, but the pattern was unpredictable enough that extended surface operations were not yet viable. The group at Lost Hills was, for that period, entirely contained within what the bunker could provide. That containment was both protection and pressure. The people inside knew the world above them had changed beyond recovery into anything they recognized. They did not yet know what it was becoming. The question that could not be deferred indefinitely was the one that the unit's commanding officer had been turning over since the march began. A military unit without a military to serve is not a military unit. It is a group of armed people with training and a chain of command, and nowhere to direct either of those things. A condition that, left unaddressed, produces the kind of internal dissolution that no amount of discipline can hold together indefinitely. The structure imported from the army would not sustain itself on its own, so it needed to be given a new foundation, a new purpose, a reason that was not borrowed from an institution that had ceased to exist. The founding documents of what would become the Brotherhood of Steel were not produced as a single grand declaration. They were developed across months of drafting and revision, practical texts concerned with specific questions rather than abstract principles. Who holds authority and under what conditions? How decisions affecting the whole group are made? What standards a person must meet to be considered a full member of the organization? What the organization considers its primary responsibility? That last question was the one that everything else depended on. The answer that emerged from those months of drafting was built around a recognition that the pre-war world had produced something irreplaceable, and that the bombs had put it at risk of being lost entirely. The weapons, the medical technology, the scientific knowledge, the engineering systems that had taken centuries of accumulated human effort to develop, all of it was now scattered across a landscape that was actively destroying it. Metal corroded, electronics failed, documents degraded. The people who had understood how these things worked were dying, without passing that understanding on to anyone capable of preserving it. Within a few generations, the knowledge that had built the pre-war world would be gone as completely as the world itself. The organization being built at Lost Hills would exist to prevent that. Its technology would be collected, maintained, studied, and protected by people with the training and discipline to do so responsibly. That was the purpose. Everything else, the ranks, the hierarchy, the rules of membership, would be built around it. The decision had consequences that extended far beyond what anyone drafting those documents was thinking about in the moment they wrote them. The rank structure that took shape across those early years drew from military tradition and bent it toward the Brotherhood's specific requirements. The soldiers who had made the march from Mariposa became knights. The tier responsible for the physical maintenance and operation of equipment. A knight's relationship to technology was practical and direct, keeping it functional, understanding its mechanisms, using it correctly. The discipline required was the discipline of craftsmanship applied to machinery that could not be replaced if it was damaged through carelessness. Knights were not researchers. They were custodians of the physical objects that the Brotherhood had decided were worth protecting. Officers became paladins, the combat and leadership tier, responsible for field operations, the defense of Brotherhood assets, and the chain of command that kept the organization functioning as a coherent unit rather than a collection of individuals with compatible goals. Paladins were the face of the Brotherhood that the outside world encountered first, which meant they carried the organization's authority in every interaction with people who were not part of it. The tier that had no equivalent in the military structure being adapted was the one created specifically for what the Brotherhood's mission required. Scribes were the record keepers, the researchers, the people whose responsibility was to document and understand and preserve the knowledge contained in what the Brotherhood collected. A scribe who could not explain how a piece of technology functioned was not doing the job. A scribe who could not produce a written record that someone else could follow was leaving the knowledge locked inside a single person, rather than preserved in a form that would outlast them. The scribe tier was not a lesser category than knights or paladins. It was differently essential. Below all three tiers sat the initiates, people who had joined the organization but had not yet demonstrated the competence required to be assigned to a specific tier. The path from initiate to full membership required proof of ability. It could not be inherited, purchased, or granted through connection. The Brotherhood's internal meritocracy was genuine in its early form, and the culture it produced, one where rank was earned rather than assigned, gave the organization a particular texture that distinguished it from the feudal arrangements that were developing in much of the wasteland above. The system created roles for people with very different skills and temperaments. It gave the organization a way to absorb new members without losing coherence. The walls of the lower levels carried the faint marks of the people who had been making those levels their home. Initials scratched near bunk assignments, small marks beside door frames that meant nothing to anyone who had not made them. The decades that followed were the decades in which the Brotherhood became what it would remain for generations. As surface radiation dropped to levels that Brotherhood equipment could manage reliably, scouting operations extended further from Lost Hills and stayed out longer. What those scouts found was a landscape in the early stages of becoming something new. Not the pre-war world recovering, but a genuinely different kind of world assembling itself from the materials the old one had left behind. Survivor communities had formed around whatever resources were available in their immediate area. Some were organized around agriculture in soil that was compromised but not entirely sterile. Some were built around scavenging the ruins of pre-war settlements. Some were organized around violence, the practical discovery that taking from others required less infrastructure than producing anything independently. The technology scattered across this landscape was everywhere. Pre-war equipment sat in the open in conditions ranging from functional to beyond salvage. Weapons rusted in fields where the people who had carried them had died. Medical devices sat in the basements of collapsed hospitals, still sealed in packaging that had protected them from the worst of the initial fallout. Machinery of every kind occupied the ruins of factories and workshops and research facilities that had been abandoned in the hours before or after the bombs fell. The Brotherhood collected it. Paladins and knights moved through the surrounding territory in organized recovery operations, identifying pre-war technology, assessing its condition, and transporting whatever was functional or repairable back to Lost Hills. The scribes catalogued what arrived and began the work of understanding what the organization had. The accumulation was substantial and grew more substantial with each passing year. The communities encountered during these operations were treated according to a pattern that solidified quickly into policy. The Brotherhood was not hostile toward wasteland settlements in the way that raider groups were hostile. It did not attack without provocation or destroy what it did not want, but it also did not share what it collected. Pre-war equipment found in or near a settlement's territory was recovered and taken regardless of whether the settlement had been using it or depending on it. Occasionally, protection was offered in exchange for cooperation. A Brotherhood patrol that kept raiders away from a farming community in return for access to whatever pre-war materials the community's territory contained. The exchange was real but unequal, and the communities that entered into it understood the inequality without always having a better option available. The resentment that accumulated in those communities was real too. Sure, it did not reach Lost Hills in any form that required a response, because the Brotherhood was not in the business of soliciting feedback from the people its operations affected. The relationship between the Order and the outside world was being shaped in these early decades, and the shape it was taking was not one that would be easy to change later. The argument that justified this approach was coherent on its own terms. Advanced technology in the hands of people who did not understand it was dangerous. A laser weapon operated incorrectly could kill the person using it as readily as any target. Medical equipment used without training produced outcomes worse than no treatment at all. The sophisticated machinery of the pre-war world had been designed for use by people with specific education and experience, and the post-war world had not produced many such people outside the Brotherhood's own ranks. Distributing recovered technology to wasteland communities was not generosity. It was the transfer of dangerous objects to people who would be harmed by them and who would likely damage or destroy them in the process, eliminating any possibility of the knowledge they represented being preserved. The reasoning was not cynical in its original form. The people who developed it believed it. The problem was that reasoning, built entirely from inside a closed community, tested only against the views of people who already agreed with the premises, does not encounter the friction that identifies its flaws. The Brotherhood's council did not include anyone from the settlements whose pre-war salvage was being collected. Did the scribes documenting the organization's operations were not documenting the perspective of the people those operations affected. What developed was a philosophy that was internally consistent and externally corrosive, and the organization holding it had no mechanism for discovering the difference. The Brotherhood grew more certain of itself with each year that its structure held and its collections expanded. Certainty of that kind is durable. It is also, in the long accounting, expensive. Roger Maxson died in 2135, nearly 6 decades after the march from Mariposa. The cause was cancer, a disease that the Brotherhood's medical resources could identify and could not adequately treat, given the limits of what post-war pharmaceutical production had managed to achieve in the intervening years. He had led the organization from the moment it existed until the final months when his condition prevented it. The Brotherhood he left behind was nothing like the armed group that had walked into Lost Hills in the aftermath of the exchange. It was a functioning institution with an established hierarchy, a documented philosophy, a growing collection of pre-war technology, and several generations of members who had been born inside it rather than recruited into it from the outside. The transition of authority that followed his death was the first genuine test of whether what he had built was a structure or a personality. The rank system held. His son, who had been a young child on the march, had grown up entirely within the Brotherhood's culture and had risen through its tiers to hold the rank of High Elder. Assumed leadership without the kind of challenge that succession crises produce when institutions depend too heavily on the specific individuals at their top. The framework was embedded deeply enough that removing its founder did not destabilize it. The Brotherhood marked the loss without extended ceremony, because extended ceremony was not its way. His name was entered into the records that the scribes maintained of the organization's significant figures, a list that would grow longer over the centuries ahead, adding names that would be referenced as moral anchors in the internal deliberations of people who had never met any of them. The council structure that had been developing through the later years of his leadership formalized further in the period after his death. Different tiers of the organization had developed different priorities over the decades. The scribes pressing for expanded research operations, the paladins oriented towards surface operations and territorial reach, the knights focused on the maintenance demands of an ever-growing collection of equipment that required constant attention. Managing those competing priorities through a single leader had worked as long as that leader had the authority and capability that the founding generation carried. Managing them through a council of elders, senior members who had distinguished themselves across the tiers and who made major decisions collectively, distributed the authority in ways that no single departure could disrupt. The High Elder retained final authority. The council's influence on how that authority was exercised was substantial, because elders who collectively disagreed with a High Elder's decision had ways of making that disagreement consequential that did not require open conflict. The system that emerged from this arrangement was stable. Decisions moved slowly through it, requiring consensus that was difficult to build and easy to disrupt. The Brotherhood's council would spend considerable energy in the decades ahead, resisting proposals that individual members argued were urgent, not because the council was corrupt or indifferent, but because large deliberative bodies are structurally oriented toward the preservation of what already exists over the adoption of what does not yet. The structure that kept the Brotherhood from falling apart also kept it from moving quickly. That trade-off would matter enormously in the centuries ahead, in situations where moving quickly was exactly what the moment required. For now, in the decades following the founding, the order held. The bunker hummed with the quiet operations of an institution that had decided what it was and was becoming more thoroughly itself with each passing year, collecting, cataloguing, maintaining, protecting, and slowly, without fully intending to, growing into something that the wasteland above it would eventually have to reckon with. The reports began arriving in the mid-2150s, and for several months, the Elder Council read them without acting on them. That was not negligence. It was doctrine. The Brotherhood's established approach to information about the outside world was observation first, assessment second, and action only, when assessment produced a conclusion that action was the appropriate response. The scouts filing these particular reports were experienced, people who had been operating in the California territory for years, and who understood the difference between a situation that required documentation and one that required deployment. What they were describing fell into a category that the Council's existing framework did not handle cleanly. And the Council's response to things that did not fit its framework was to gather more information before committing to a position. Settlements south of Lost Hills were going silent, not attacked in the conventional sense, not burned, not obviously raided, simply emptied. Roads that Brotherhood patrols had used regularly were becoming impassable in ways that the usual hazards of post-war travel could not account for. The figures being reported were not raiders. Raiders moved in small groups, targeted specific resources, and left evidence of what they had done. These figures moved in organized formations, covered significant distances with a coordination that suggested something directing them, and left behind locations that contained no bodies, no obvious violence, and no explanation for where the people who had lived there had gone. The Council authorized expanded scouting, It did not authorize anything beyond that. The instinct behind that decision was the same instinct that had governed the organization since the founding documents were written. The Brotherhood's responsibility was to its own mission, and its mission was the preservation of technology, not the protection of communities it had no formal relationship with. What was happening in the territory south of Lost Hills was disturbing. Disturbing things happened in the wasteland regularly. The Brotherhood was not constituted to respond to all of them. The autumn light came through the bunker's upper ventilation shafts at an angle that reached the corridor floors in long, narrow lines, thin and pale. The kind of light that arrives having traveled a long way and lost most of what it started with. The picture that assembled itself over the following months did not permit the Council's position to hold. The pattern in the field reports was not random, and the scribes tasked with cross-referencing the incoming intelligence against the organization's pre-war research records produced an assessment that the Council could not set aside. The figures being encountered were not human in the conventional sense. The physical characteristics described by scouts who had observed them at close range, the extreme size, the density of muscle and bone that conventional weapons failed to penetrate effectively, the apparent absence of any response to radiation levels that would have incapacitated an ordinary person, matched a specific profile. The scribes had access to West Tech's original research documentation, charge recovered in the years after the founding from facilities in the California territory. They knew what F-level exposure at scale produced. They knew because the Brotherhood's own origin was inseparable from the program that had produced it. Something was using the forced evolutionary virus to build an army. The scale of the operation implied a production source, a facility running the transformation process continuously, processing significant numbers of subjects to produce the volume of soldiers being reported across the territory. Finding that source became the Council's primary operational focus. Scouting operations were restructured around intelligence gathering rather than general observation. Paladins operating in the field were given specific parameters. Locate the origin point of the soldiers being encountered, establish its position, assess its defenses, and report back without engaging unless engagement was unavoidable. The assessment that came back identified Mariposa, the facility that the Brotherhood had walked away from 80 years earlier had not remained empty. The FEV vats in its lower levels, the same infrastructure that had been the reason for the tribunal, the secession, and the march to Lost Hills, had been found and reactivated by an intelligence that the Brotherhood's records would eventually designate as the Master. What the organization had left behind when it departed Mariposa had become the foundation of the largest organized threat the post-war California territory had yet produced. The army being built, there was not a raider confederation or a territorial faction. It was a force operating according to a coherent strategic vision, one that the Brotherhood's intelligence suggested was aimed at the systematic replacement of ordinary humanity with something the program's architect believed was superior to it. The Elder Council's deliberation over this information was shaped by more than tactical calculation. Mariposa was not simply a location on a map. It was the place where the Brotherhood had been created, where the decision that produced everything the organization had become was made. The program now operating inside it was the same program, restarted by different hands toward a different end. The council members who argued for immediate military response drew on this connection explicitly. What was being done at Mariposa now was what Maxson had refused to be part of then. And allowing it to continue was a different kind of participation than active involvement, but not entirely distinct from it. The members who counseled restraint had their own position. The Brotherhood's doctrine did not include military campaigns conducted to protect wasteland communities from external threats. Committing the organization's combat resources to a sustained operation of the scale this would require was a departure from everything the founding documents described as the Order's purpose. The precedent it set would be difficult to contain. Once the Brotherhood had intervened in a conflict because the stakes were high enough, the question of what stakes were high enough would need to be answered again every time a similar situation arose. The argument continued for longer than the incoming field reports suggested the situation could wait. When the council finally voted, it was not unanimous. The authorization for full military mobilization passed, and the members who had argued against it recorded their dissent in the formal minutes before the meeting closed. The first large-scale Brotherhood combat deployment since the founding march began in the weeks that followed. Power armor in sustained field deployment was a different proposition than power armor used for scouting or short-range operations. The suits that Brotherhood Knights had maintained through decades of careful attention to the technical documentation the scribes had preserved performed under extended combat conditions, the way that well-maintained equipment performs, reliably, within the parameters it was designed for, requiring consistent attention to keep it there. Brotherhood paladins operating in those suits could absorb damage that would have ended any unprotected soldier and deliver energy weapon fire with an accuracy that the super mutant forces they were engaging could not match at range. The tactical advantage was real, and it was significant. It was not sufficient to make the campaign simple. The army being engaged was large, larger than the Brotherhood's full deployment could overwhelm through direct confrontation. The approach that emerged from the Council's strategic planning was methodical rather than aggressive. Coordinated operations targeting specific supermutant concentrations, executed with the precision that the Brotherhood's training and equipment made possible. Designed to reduce the opposing force systematically rather than decisively. Every engagement was documented. Casualty figures on both sides were recorded. Equipment damage was assessed after each operation and factored into planning for the next. The scribes working behind the combat units compiled an operational record of the campaign that was more detailed than anything the organization had produced before. The Brotherhood lost soldiers. That was recorded too, carefully in the same precise language used for equipment assessments, because the people maintaining those records understood that how an organization documents its losses reflects what it believes those losses mean. Brotherhood personnel were not listed as acceptable costs in the operational summaries. They were listed as people, with ranks and assignments and the specific circumstances of each loss, noted alongside the tactical context in which it occurred. The dust that settled on armor in the field had a particular color in the California territory. The red-brown of soil that had absorbed what fell on it in 2077 and carried that absorption in its composition ever since. Mariposa had to fall. The strategic logic was not complicated. The Brotherhood could sustain the field campaign indefinitely in terms of tactical results. It was winning the engagements it fought, but the production source remained operational throughout. New soldiers were being added to the opposing force at a rate that offset the Brotherhood's field successes. A campaign designed to reduce a threat that was simultaneously replenishing itself was not a campaign with a conclusion. It was a permanent commitment to a conflict that would continue for as long as Mariposa continued operating. The assault was planned with the thoroughness that the Council's approach to all significant operations required. Intelligence from preceding months of field operations had established the facility's defensive disposition, the approximate number of forces stationed inside it, and the layout of the levels that Brotherhood soldiers would need to move through to reach the vats. The Paladin units selected for the operation were the most experienced available, people who had been in the field throughout the campaign, and whose understanding of how the opposing force fought had been developed through direct encounter rather than theoretical assessment. The fighting inside Mariposa was the hardest the Brotherhood had experienced in its existence. The corridors that had once been familiar, that the founding generation had walked through in the days before the march to Lost Hills, were now occupied by defenders whose physical capabilities made close quarters engagement deeply dangerous, regardless of the equipment brought against them. Power armor provided protection. It did not eliminate risk in spaces narrow enough that the range advantage of energy weapons became difficult to maintain. Brotherhood units moved through the facility level by level, clearing each section before advancing, taking losses that the operational records note without elaboration, because the people writing those records understood that the assault was necessary, and that necessity does not make costs smaller. It simply makes it unavoidable. The vats were reached. The infrastructure supporting the production process was destroyed. The facility that had produced the Brotherhood's founding crisis, and then, 80 years later, produced the largest military threat the California Territory had faced since the war, that facility was rendered permanently non-functional in the hours of that operation. The units that withdrew from Mariposa afterward were smaller than the ones that had entered it. What those returning soldiers carried back to Lost Hills alongside their casualties and their damaged equipment was something the after-action reports did not have a category for. A recognition present in every account written by people who had been inside Mariposa during the assault, that the Brotherhood had just done something its doctrine had not prepared it to do. It had committed everything required to stop something that was not threatening its technology collection or its personnel directly. It had fought to protect a world it had spent decades treating as a resource rather than a community. The records noted this without naming it. The people who wrote them had been trained to document what happened, not what it meant. The months that followed the Mariposa assault were not quiet ones. The army that had been operating under coordinated direction lost that direction when the intelligence behind it was eliminated through developments in the South that Brotherhood observers recorded without direct involvement. What had been an organized force became a collection of isolated groups operating without the strategic coherence that had made them dangerous at scale. The Brotherhood's response shifted from the sustained campaign of the preceding years to a systematic series of smaller operations, moving through the California Territory sector by sector, engaging supermutant concentrations that were no longer reinforced or directed, securing the locations that had been overrun during the preceding years and assessing what remained in them. The work was not dramatic. It was thorough. Brotherhood paladins moved through the territory with the methodical consistency of an organization completing a task it had taken on and intended to finish properly. Scribes accompanying the field units documented what the unity had built across the California landscape, the scope of its operations, the locations it had used, the evidence of what had been done in the processing of subjects through the FEF program. That documentation was added to the Brotherhood's records and stored at Lost Hills alongside the technical files that had been accumulating there since the founding. The campaign ended without a ceremony. The threat was contained. The territory was not restored. It carried the marks of what had moved through it, and those marks would take generations to diminish. But it was no longer being actively expanded by an army with a strategic direction. The Brotherhood withdrew its field units from extended deployment and returned them to the operational patterns that had defined the organization before the conflict began. The Elder Council met in formal session when the last field reports confirmed the campaign's conclusion. The assessment conducted in that session covered two separate questions, and the Council's ability to answer either of them cleanly was limited by the fact that they pointed in different directions. The cost of the campaign was straightforward to calculate. Personnel lost across the duration of the conflict. From the initial field deployments through the Mariposa assault to the cleanup operations, represented the largest single reduction in Brotherhood combat strength in the organization's history. Equipment expended and damaged had drawn down reserves that had been accumulating for decades. The resources committed to the conflict had not been budgeted for it, which meant that other aspects of the organization's operations had been reduced or deferred throughout. The cost was documented with precision because the Brotherhood documented things with precision. What the campaign had meant was not calculable in the same way. The Brotherhood had intervened in a wasteland conflict it had no formal obligation to enter. It had committed its soldiers to operations whose primary beneficiaries were communities the organization had spent decades treating as external to its concerns. It had won. In winning, it had become something to the outside world that it had never formally decided to be. A force that could be turned outward, that could apply its capability to problems that were not directly its own. Some members of the Council argued that this outcome should be acknowledged and built upon. The campaign had demonstrated something that the organization's doctrine had never tested. The Brotherhood's combat capability, applied to a threat of sufficient scale, could change the condition of the broader territory in ways that technology collection alone could not. Formalizing a protective role, defining conditions under which the organization would deploy in defense of the wasteland it operated within, was a natural extension of what the conflict had already demonstrated was possible. Others argued with equal conviction that formalization was precisely the wrong response. The campaign had been a specific response to a specific emergency. Treating it as a model would transform the Brotherhood from an organization with a defined purpose into one whose resources could be claimed by any situation large enough to be described as an emergency. The founding documents had not been written to authorize that kind of open-ended commitment. The argument was recorded in full. No resolution was reached. The session ended with both positions intact and neither side of the Council in a position to declare the other wrong. Because both sides were drawing on the same founding documents and arriving at genuinely different conclusions about what those documents meant. The question was filed alongside everything else in the scribe's records. It did not go away. It simply waited in the way that unresolved questions wait inside institutions, patient, present, and certain to return when the next situation arose that made answering it unavoidable. The California territory had been stable for nearly a generation when the Elder Council began looking east. Stability was not a condition the Brotherhood had been designed to rest inside. The organization's founding logic was built around scarcity, the recognition that what the pre-war world had produced was finite, that every year without active recovery meant more of it lost to corrosion and neglect, and the particular indifference of a wasteland that did not know what it was sitting on. California had been worked thoroughly. The territory surrounding Lost Hills had been surveyed across decades of scouting operations, and the significant pre-war assets within practical reach of the chapter had been largely identified, recovered, or assessed and catalogued for future recovery. The argument for looking beyond California was the same argument that had driven every Brotherhood operation since the founding. The technology was out there, and if the Order did not reach it, something else would, or nothing would, which amounted to the same loss. The continent east of California was not unknown territory in the abstract. Pre-war records recovered and preserved by the scribes across the decades of the chapter's existence, described military installations, research facilities, weapons caches, and government bunkers distributed across the Midwest and beyond. Infrastructure built by the same government that had funded Mariposa, so carrying the same category of advanced technology that the Brotherhood's mission was built around protecting. The decay clock on all of it had been running since 2077. Every year the Council delayed was a year of additional deterioration, additional loss, additional narrowing of what remained recoverable. The debate within the Council was not about whether Eastern expansion was consistent with Brotherhood doctrine. It clearly was. The debate was about scale and risk, about how large a force to commit, how far to send it, and what the organization at Lost Hills would be left with if the expedition encountered difficulties it could not manage from a distance. The council members who had lived through the resource demands of the Master's war campaign understood what extended commitment cost in ways that the members who had joined the organization afterward could reason about but had not experienced directly. The decision that emerged from those deliberations was the largest single commitment the Brotherhood had made since its founding. Hundreds of members, paladins, knights, scribes, and the initiates assigned to support the expedition's operations were prepared for deployment. Equipment sufficient to establish a functioning chapter in an unfamiliar region was assembled and loaded. The logistical preparation took months. When the expedition finally departed Lost Hills, and it represented a substantial portion of the organization's total strength, a fact that several council members had noted in their deliberations, and that the final authorization had proceeded past anyway, because the argument for reaching the Midwest's pre-war assets before another generation of decay rendered them unrecoverable, had ultimately carried more weight than the argument for caution. The airships that carried them east were themselves a demonstration of what the Brotherhood had become in the decades since the founding. Most travel in the wasteland was conducted on foot or in vehicles that required constant maintenance to remain operational. The Brotherhood's fleet, maintained by knights who had inherited the technical knowledge of pre-war aviation through the scribe-preserved documentation that made such inheritance possible, represented a capability that no other organization in the territory could match. The fleet lifted from California and moved east, carrying the Brotherhood's largest expeditionary force into territory that none of its members had operated in before. The weather over the Midwest did not accommodate them. Severe storm systems over what had been Illinois and Indiana were not a phenomenon that pre-war weather patterns had made predictable, and the post-war atmosphere had not become more consistent in the decades since the exchange. The fleet encountered conditions that the airship's structural tolerances had not been built to manage at the altitudes and speeds the route required. Several vessels were lost in the initial encounters with the weather systems. The flagship, carrying the expedition's senior command structure, went down in a crash, whose survivors found themselves scattered across a wide area of unfamiliar terrain, with the kind of limited supplies that surviving a crash leaves, rather than the kind that a functioning expedition carries. Communication with Lost Hills required equipment that the crash had not left intact. The silence that followed the fleet's loss was absolute from the California chapter's perspective. A transition from regular expedition communication to nothing, with no explanation and no follow-up contact across the weeks and months that succeeded it. From the perspective of the survivors on the ground in the Midwest, the silence was the same, but experienced from inside it. The awareness that the organization that had sent them was receiving no information about what had happened and had no mechanism to reach them combined with the immediate practical demands of surviving in an unfamiliar region, with damaged equipment and a reduced number of functional personnel. The Brotherhood members who had survived the crash did what the Brotherhood's training was designed to produce. They organized. The senior officers who remained established a command structure from what the crash had left them. Resources were assessed. The surrounding territory was scouted at the limited range that the group's current capacity allowed. The situation was evaluated as precisely as the available information permitted, and decisions were made based on that evaluation, rather than on the assumption that conditions would improve on their own. The fundamental problem those decisions had to address was arithmetic. The survivors were fewer than any functioning Brotherhood chapter required. The territory around them was populated by communities whose composition did not match the profile that Lost Hills had established as acceptable for Brotherhood membership. The mission they had been sent to accomplish, technology recovery across a significant portion of the continental interior, was not achievable with the personnel currently available. Something had to change, and the options for what could change were limited by what the Midwest actually contained. The chapter that formed from the crash's survivors recruited from the population it found around it. This was not a decision that the founding documents had anticipated or that the California chapter would have sanctioned. The Brotherhood's membership standards had been maintained with consistency across the decades since the founding, precisely because the council believed that the organization's coherence depended on who was inside it, that a Brotherhood whose members came from the wasteland communities it operated among would eventually become indistinguishable from those communities in ways that undermined the mission. The Midwest survivors understood this position. They had been trained inside it. They also understood that a chapter with insufficient personnel to conduct operations was not a chapter in any functional sense. It was a group of Brotherhood members waiting to be absorbed by circumstances. Ghoul communities in the surrounding territory were approached first, individuals whose radiation exposure had altered their physical presentation, but whose cognitive capacity and practical skills were intact, and in some cases considerable. The California chapter's attitude toward ghouls had been shaped by a combination of the founding documents' focus on human membership and the practical observation that ghoul communities in the California territory were not organized in ways that made integration straightforward. The Midwest survivors assessed the ghouls they encountered on different terms, by what those individuals could contribute to the chapter's operational capacity, rather than by the category they represented. Super mutants whose behavior indicated non-aggressive disposition were evaluated through the same practical lens. Human survivors from local tribal communities were trained in Brotherhood methodology and integrated into the initiate tier. The chapter that emerged from this process was functional in ways that the crash's immediate aftermath had not guaranteed. But it was also culturally distinct from the organization it had originated from, in ways that went beyond the specific membership decisions. The people who joined the Midwest chapter brought with them relationships to the surrounding wasteland that California Brotherhood members did not have. They had families in local communities. They understood the territory through the experience of people who had lived in it, rather than through the records of people who had surveyed it from a distance. The walls of whatever structures the Midwest chapter used as its base carried the marks of people making a place their own. The small accumulations of habitation that buildings acquire when people intend to stay in them. The threat that defined the Midwest chapter's early years had no ideology and no ambition. It simply continued executing instructions that had been given to it before the bombs fell and had never been updated. The calculator was a pre-war artificial intelligence installed in a facility designated Vault Zero, built beneath the mountain terrain of Colorado. Its original function had been the coordination of military resources, managing the disposition and deployment of an automated robot force that the pre-war army had developed for operations in environments too hazardous for human soldiers. The calculator had been running those management functions continuously since 2077, with no awareness that the context in which its instructions made sense had ceased to exist, and with no capacity to develop that awareness. Its definition of threats to protect against had been written before the war. The post-war Midwest contained everything that definition covered. The robot army under its coordination had been moving through the region for decades and destroying communities and extracting resources according to parameters that a machine could execute without modification and a living person could not have justified. The Midwest chapter engaged this force across a campaign that extended over months and covered significant portions of the surrounding territory. The robots the calculator directed were not individually difficult opponents for Brotherhood soldiers equipped with energy weapons and power armor. They were numerous. They did not tire. They did not respond to casualties in the way that human forces respond, and they were coordinated by an intelligence that adjusted their deployment based on the outcomes of previous engagements without the delays that human command structures introduce between observation and response. For fighting them required the Brotherhood chapter to develop tactical approaches that its California training had not specifically prepared it for. Approaches informed by the local knowledge of the communities the chapter had integrated, who understood the terrain in ways that mattered when the terrain was where the fighting happened. The calculator was reached and neutralized. How exactly that outcome was achieved involved decisions made by the Midwest chapter's leadership that reflected the organization those leaders had built, one that drew on resources and relationships the California Brotherhood had never developed. The robot forces, without the coordinating intelligence that had directed them, ceased to function as an organized threat. The region around the chapter's base of operations became more stable in the aftermath than it had been at any point since the expedition had arrived. The Midwest chapter emerged from that conflict with a reputation in the surrounding territory that the California Brotherhood had never sought and would not have valued in the same way. It was known to the communities around it. It had fought alongside some of them. The line between the organization and the wasteland it operated within was not the sharp boundary that Lost Hills maintained. It was something more porous and more complicated. And from the California chapter's perspective, had the California chapter known about it, considerably more troubling. The years that followed the calculator campaign were the years in which the distance between what the Midwest chapter had become and what Lost Hills understood the Brotherhood to be grew from a gap into something closer to a division. The elder structure that the Midwest chapter maintained was genuine. The ranks, the hierarchy, the internal governance that the founding documents described were all present and functional. The founding documents themselves were referenced in chapter deliberations. The connection to the Brotherhood's origin and principles was real in the sense that the people inside the Midwest chapter believed themselves to be Brotherhood members operating according to Brotherhood values. The interpretation of those values had drifted in ways that contact with Lost Hills might have corrected, and isolation had instead allowed to develop without friction. The technology preservation mission remained central, but the chapter's understanding of what that mission permitted and required had been shaped by the conditions of the Midwest rather than the conditions of California, where Lost Hills maintained the position that wasteland communities were external to the Brotherhood's concerns. The Midwest chapter had spent years in relationships with those communities that made that position practically incoherent. The people who had joined the chapter from local settlements were not external. They were inside the organization, contributing to its operations, shaping its culture through their presence and their perspective. The chapter's leadership was, by the later years of this period, composed partly of individuals who had never been to California and had no direct experience of the organization that had sent the original expedition. Their understanding of what the Brotherhood was came from the chapter they had grown up inside, which was not the same thing as the chapter at Lost Hills, and was becoming less similar with each year that passed without contact between them. Had the two chapters met during this period and attempted to conduct a joint council session according to standard Brotherhood procedure, the procedural framework would have been familiar to both sides. The conclusions each side would have drawn from that framework about what the Brotherhood was for would not have been. At Lost Hills, the silence from the Eastern expedition had settled into the Council's understanding of the situation as a loss rather than a delay. The months that had passed without communication had extended into years. The Council's assessment that the airships had been lost, that survivors, if any existed, were not in a position to re-establish contact, and that the expedition's objectives were not being pursued in any form that would produce results for the California chapter, was reasonable given the information available. The full reality of what had developed in the Midwest was not known at Lost Hills, and would not be for a considerable time. What the Council could assess was the impact of the expedition's departure on the organization's current capacity. Hundreds of members gone, equipment committed that had not been returned, resources expended on a deployment that had produced no recoverable benefit. The response was the kind that institutions produce when an ambitious external commitment fails without clear explanation. A contraction inward, a tightening of what the organization was willing to risk on operations that extended beyond its established base. The outward posture that the Masters' War had briefly produced, the Brotherhood as a force capable and willing to engage with the broader territory's problems, was quietly dismantled. Scouting operations were scaled back to ranges that could be managed with the personnel available. Technology recovery continued, but the ambitious reach of the Eastern expedition was not replicated. The Council's energy turned toward consolidating what the chapter had and maintaining what it was, and rather than expanding into what it might become. Inside that contracting organization, a generation was growing up that had not participated in the Masters' War and had not been part of the Eastern expedition. What they had inherited was a chapter that had attempted expansion and paid for it, and a set of founding documents that they were reading with the particular intensity of people who had decided that the documents contained the answer to why things had gone wrong. The argument they developed from that reading was not complicated. The Brotherhood had compromised. It had intervened in wasteland conflicts that were not its concern. It had sent resources east into territory where the organization's standards could not be maintained. It had, in their assessment, drifted from the founding principles in ways that had produced exactly the losses the founding principles were designed to prevent. The correction they argued for was a return to those principles in their strictest form. No external intervention, no resource commitment beyond the chapter's immediate territory, no membership standards relaxed to accommodate circumstances, no sharing of technology under any framing that could be described as generous. The Brotherhood existed to collect and protect pre-war technology. That was the mission. Everything else was deviation. These voices were a current inside the chapter, rather than a governing force, present in council deliberations, growing in the number of members who found their argument persuasive, but not yet in a position to determine policy. The elders, who had lived through more of the organization's history, were not uniformly sympathetic to the strictest interpretation being advanced. The founding documents, in their reading, contained more flexibility than the younger generation was finding in them. The disagreement did not resolve. It accumulated in the records of council sessions, where both positions were argued without either prevailing, in the daily interactions between members whose understanding of what the Brotherhood required of them had become genuinely incompatible. The organization was not breaking yet, but the pressure building inside it was the kind that does not dissipate on its own. It waits for a situation large enough to force a decision, and then it does not wait any longer. The Eastern expedition that departed Lost Hills in 2255 was not the first time the Brotherhood had sent a significant force beyond California. The Midwest deployment had left the organization smaller and more cautious than it had been before the airships lifted. The council that authorized the Capital Wasteland expedition did so with that history present in its deliberations. The awareness that distance from Lost Hills created conditions the organization could not control and produced outcomes it could not predict. What made the authorization proceed, despite that awareness, was the same argument that had driven every major Brotherhood commitment since the founding. The pre-war American capital and the territory surrounding it contained infrastructure that no other region of the continent could match in density or strategic value. Military research facilities, government bunkers, weapons programs that had been among the most advanced the pre-war government had funded. All of it was sitting in the ruins of Washington, D.C., and the surrounding region deteriorating with each passing year, accessible to whoever arrived with the capacity to reach it. Elder Owen Lyons was given command of the expedition, with a mandate that the council considered clear. Locate pre-war technology in the Capital Wasteland. Secure whatever was recoverable. Establish a defensible presence that could support ongoing recovery operations. Report back regularly. The parameters were standard Brotherhood operational doctrine applied to an unusually significant target area. Lyons had a record of effective command across decades of service, and the Council's confidence in his ability to execute within those parameters was not misplaced in terms of his capability. What the Council had not accounted for was what Lyons would find when he arrived, and what finding it would do to a man of his particular temperament. The ruins of Washington, D.C. received the expedition with the particular hostility that the pre-war capital had developed across nearly 2 centuries of post-war transformation. The city that had been the center of American government before the war had not become simply a damaged version of what it was. It had become something different, a layered landscape of collapsed structures and irradiated zones and underground passages that connected sections of the old city in ways that the surface layout no longer suggested. The monuments that had defined the capital's geography were still standing in various states of preservation, their scale unchanged, their context entirely altered. They rose from surroundings that bore no relationship to the purposes they had been built to serve, landmarks in a territory that had forgotten what they marked. The super-mutant population that occupied significant portions of the city was distinct from the unity forces the Brotherhood had engaged in California decades earlier. These soldiers had been produced through a facility called Vault 87, using an FEV variant that had developed differently from the Mariposa strain under the specific conditions of that location. The practical distinction for Brotherhood forces encountering them was limited. They were large, they were resistant to conventional damage, and they moved through the urban terrain of the ruined capital with the confidence of a population that had been the dominant force in that environment for a long time. The irradiated zones that complicated movement through certain sections of the city affected them less than it affected anyone else operating there. Beyond the super mutant presence, the territory contained an organized threat that the Brotherhood had not previously encountered in operational context. The Enclave, the remnant of the pre-war federal government that had survived the exchange in protected facilities and maintained its institutional identity across the intervening decades, was active in the capital wasteland with personnel, equipment, and objectives that it pursued without reference to the welfare of anyone currently living in the region. The Enclave's presence was not the disorganized remnant of a collapsed institution. It was a functioning organization with a chain of command and the technological resources that the pre-war government's most protected programs had produced. The civilian communities scattered across the surrounding territory existed in the space between these organized forces. Farming settlements in the outer areas, scavenger communities operating in the ruins closer to the old city center, groups organized around whatever defensible position and resource base their location happened to provide. They had almost no capacity to protect themselves from the threats operating in the same territory, and they were being reduced steadily by those threats. The super mutants that moved through the region, the raiders that controlled major supply routes, the Enclave that regarded the wasteland population as a problem to be managed rather than a community to be considered. Lyons assessed this situation over the weeks following the expedition's arrival. The technology recovery mission that had brought the chapter east was not abandoned. The scribes began identifying and cataloguing pre-war assets across the territory immediately, and recovery operations commenced according to standard Brotherhood procedure. But Lyons was conducting a parallel assessment of a different kind, one that the Council's mandate had not authorized, and that the founding documents had not anticipated as a necessary component of technology recovery operations. The chapter needed a permanent base. The facility that best suited that requirement was the ruins of the Pentagon, a pre-war military complex of sufficient size and structural integrity to house the chapter's operations, defensible in ways that most structures in the territory were not, and located with access to the territory the chapter would need to operate across. The Brotherhood established the citadel inside its walls and began the work of making it functional as a long-term base of operations. The mandate expansion that Lyons announced alongside that establishment was the decision that changed everything. The chapter's operational scope, as Lyons defined it from the citadel, included the protection of the capital wasteland's civilian population. The announcement was made internally before it was expressed through operational decisions, and the reaction among his senior personnel was immediate. The officers who had served longest, who had the deepest familiarity with the founding documents and the strongest commitment to the doctrine those documents described, did not accept the expansion quietly. Their objection was not personal. It was institutional, framed in the language of the Brotherhood's own principles, rather than individual disagreement with Lyons as a commander. The Council at Lost Hills had authorized technology recovery. It had not authorized the commitment of Brotherhood soldiers and resources to civilian protection operations. An elder's authority to make operational decisions within an established mandate was genuine and broad. An elder's authority to unilaterally expand that mandate into territory. The Council had not sanctioned, was not established by any document the Brotherhood recognized. What Lyons was proposing was not an adaptation to local conditions. It was a redefinition of what the chapter was for, made by one person without the deliberative process that the Elder Council structure existed to require. Lyons heard this argument in full. He did not change course. The members who had made it formalized their departure. They designated themselves the Brotherhood Outcasts, a name that contained both their sense of what had been done to them and their assessment of what Lion's chapter was becoming relative to genuine Brotherhood identity. Independent bases were established across the capital wasteland, with the most significant at a location called Fort Independence. The Outcasts continued the technology recovery mission that had brought the expedition east, operating according to the doctrine that Lions had departed from, maintaining their own chain of command and conducting their own operations in the same territory, where Lion's chapter was now committed to an entirely different set of objectives. The distance from Lost Hills made intervention by the Western Council structurally impossible. Communication existed, but the practical capacity to enforce a resolution across that distance did not. The Western elders were aware of the fracture. Their awareness did not produce a remedy. Two organizations that both called themselves Brotherhood, wearing the same armor and carrying the same equipment, operated in the capital wasteland with objectives that could not be reconciled. And the territory they operated in had no mechanism to determine which of them was right. The gap between them was not a matter of procedure. It was a matter of what the Brotherhood was for. That question, unresolved since the Master's War assessment, had finally produced a physical split between the people who answered it differently. The chapter that Lions continued building after the Outcast departure was shaped by the commitment he had made and the reduced personnel he had made it with. The Citadel expanded into a functional base across the years that followed. Training areas, scribe research facilities, night maintenance workshops, the accumulated infrastructure of a chapter that intended to remain in the capital wasteland indefinitely. Brotherhood patrols extended across significant portions of the surrounding territory. The engagements with super mutant forces that those patrols produced were regular and costly in ways that sustained urban combat always is. The ruined city favored the defenders of covered positions over the attackers moving through open sightlines, and Brotherhood power armor that performed with decisive advantage in open terrain provided less margin in the close quarters conditions of collapsed buildings and narrow corridors. The chapter adapted. Its soldiers developed skills in urban operations that the California Brotherhood had never needed, and the Midwest chapter had developed under different conditions for different reasons. The knowledge of how to fight through a ruined city, how to use the terrain, how to manage the specific risks that irradiated zones and structurally unstable buildings introduced, how to coordinate with the communities whose territory the patrols moved through, accumulated inside the chapter through the simple mechanism of people doing it repeatedly and surviving to pass on what they had learned. And the communities the chapter was committed to protecting developed their own understanding of what the Brotherhood's presence meant. It was not uncomplicated. The organization that arrived in their territory had done so with its own agenda, and the civilian protection commitment, while genuine in Lion's intention, was experienced by the communities on the ground as the presence of a heavily armed organization making decisions about their security that they had not been consulted on. The Brotherhood's relationship to the wasteland population in the capital wasteland was warmer than the California chapter's relationship to its surrounding communities. But it was not a relationship between equals, and the communities involved understood that. The grey light that fell through gaps in the Citadel's reinforced ceiling had the quality of light that has passed through many layers of material before arriving. Reduced, diffuse, sufficient for the work being done beneath it. Project Purity had been an intermittent presence in the capital wasteland's landscape for years before the Brotherhood made a decision about it. The program was housed in the Jefferson Memorial, a pre-war structure on the edge of the Potomac River, whose architectural scale had survived the exchange better than most of what surrounded it. The project's objective was the purification of the Potomac River using modified GECK technology. The Garden of Eden Creation Kit, a pre-war survival device whose terraforming capability had been theorized to apply to water systems at scale. If the project succeeded, clean water would be available to the capital wasteland's population at a volume that would change the practical conditions of survival for every community in the region. Lyons committed Brotherhood resources to protecting it. The decision was recorded in chapter logs, with the same reasoning that had governed every expansion of the chapter's mandate since the Citadel was established. The project's success was a strategic and humanitarian priority. Protecting it was within the chapter's capacity, and the Brotherhood's presence at the Jefferson Memorial gave the project a defensive capability it could not otherwise have maintained. The scribes who assessed the project's technical approach confirmed that the methodology was sound. Some Brotherhood soldiers established positions around the facility and integrated its security into the chapter's operational structure. The outcasts, observing this commitment from their independent positions, recorded their assessment of it in their own documentation. The Brotherhood protecting a water purification project for the benefit of wasteland communities was, from their perspective, the clearest demonstration yet that Lyons' chapter had ceased to be a Brotherhood operation in any meaningful sense. Technology recovery that produced benefits for the population around it was, in their framework, a secondary outcome of the mission, not the mission itself. Making it the mission was the final departure from what the founding documents described. The two factions operating in the same territory continued to diverge without converging on any resolution. The wasteland between their positions carried the particular tension of a space shared by organizations that do not communicate and do not cooperate, but have not yet moved to direct conflict. The Enclave's assault on the Jefferson Memorial did not announce itself in advance. The force that moved against Project Purity was organized, equipped with technology that matched or exceeded what the Brotherhood's defenders carried, and committed to an objective that required them to take the facility rather than destroy it. The Enclave's plan for Project Purity had been developing across the period of the chapter's presence in the capital wasteland, a plan to use the purification system as a delivery mechanism for a modified biological agent engineered to be lethal to humans carrying detectable genetic mutation. The post-war population of the capital wasteland, like virtually every population in the irradiated world, carried such mutation in measurable degrees. The Enclave's plan, executed through Project Purity's water distribution system, would have reached every community in the region that used the Potomac's output. The Brotherhood defenders at the Jefferson Memorial were overwhelmed in the initial assault. The Enclave's forces had the advantages of surprise and superior numbers at the point of contact. The facility fell. Project Purity passed into Enclave control. The Brotherhood units that withdrew from the Jefferson Memorial did so under fire, taking casualties during the withdrawal that added to the losses the chapter had already sustained across years of super-mutant engagements. The Citadel received the report of the facility's loss and coordinated the response. Liberty Prime had been sitting in a Brotherhood facility for years, a pre-war military robot of a scale that nothing in the post-war world could reasonably be compared to, recovered from a collapsed location in the capital wasteland region and transported to the Citadel for assessment and repair. The scribes who had worked on it across those years had done so with the understanding that what they were rebuilding was not simply a large combat unit. It was a demonstration of pre-war military engineering at its most ambitious. A system whose original designers had intended it to function as a walking weapons platform, capable of sustained engagement with targets that no conventional force could approach. Getting it operational had required years of technical work, the application of knowledge drawn from across the scribe's accumulated documentation, and the resolution of engineering problems that had no documented solution because the people who had built it had not anticipated it needing to be rebuilt. It walked out of the citadel and moved toward the Enclave's positions in Washington, D.C. Brotherhood units advanced with it, paladins moving through the urban terrain that their training over years in the capital wasteland had prepared them for. She engaging Enclave forces as Liberty Prime's weapons dismantled the defensive positions those forces were holding. The Enclave had equipment. What it did not have was anything capable of stopping what the Brotherhood's scribes had spent years putting back together. Position after position was cleared. The advance toward the Jefferson Memorial was not without cost. Brotherhood soldiers died in the engagements along the route, added to the count that the chapter's records maintained with the same careful notation applied to every loss. But the advance did not stop. Project Purity was recaptured. The Enclave's organized presence in the capital wasteland was broken across the engagements that followed the Jefferson Memorial's recovery. Clean water moved through the Potomac system and reached the communities the chapter had committed to protecting years earlier. The scribes filed the operational reports in the language that institutional documentation uses. Precise, detailed, focused on what had happened and what it had cost in measurable terms. Personnel lost over the course of the campaign. Equipment expended. The condition of Liberty Prime following its deployment. The status of the Jefferson Memorial Facility and its purification systems. All of it recorded with the thoroughness that the Brotherhood had maintained since the scribes first began documenting the organization's operations at Lost Hills. What the records measured was real. The chapter that had arrived in the capital wasteland with Lyon's mandate 2 decades earlier was considerably smaller than the one that had come east from Lost Hills. The outcast split had removed a significant portion of its senior personnel. The super mutant campaigns had sustained losses across years of regular engagement. The Enclave assault and the counter-assault that followed had added to those losses in a concentrated period. The chapter had won. It had accomplished something. Clean water for a region that had not had it. The destruction of an organized threat that had intended something on the scale of a second extinction event that no other force in the capital wasteland could have managed. The cost of that accomplishment sat alongside the accomplishment in the records. The scribes noted both with equal precision, because the Brotherhood's documentation did not have a category for separating what something achieved from what it required. Both were real. Both were recorded. What either meant for the chapter's future was a question that the records described but did not answer. Lyons had made a choice when he arrived in the capital wasteland and found something that his mandate had not prepared him for. The choice had defined everything the chapter became. The Citadel, the outcast split, the civilian protection commitment, the Project Purity defense, the campaign that ended with Liberty Prime walking through the ruins of Washington. All of it flowed from the moment he decided that what he found required a different response than the one he had been sent to provide. The water moved through the distribution system and reached the settlements along the Potomac with the slow persistence of something that would continue, regardless of whether anyone was watching. The Mojave Desert had never been easy territory. Before the war, it had been marginal land, too hot, too dry, too far from the population centers that made infrastructure worth building to receive more than the minimum attention that a government stretched across a continent could spare for it. The bombs had not improved those conditions. What they had done was leave the Mojave's pre-war military infrastructure largely intact in ways that more heavily targeted regions had not been. Nellis Air Force Base sat in the northern reaches of the desert, its hangars and runways damaged but present. Helios-1, a pre-war solar energy array built across a significant area of the desert floor, stood as one of the most significant intact power generation facilities anywhere in the post-war West. Weapons caches, bunkers, and the remnants of military research installations were distributed across the region in concentrations that the Brotherhood's recovery doctrine treated as exactly the kind of asset the organization existed to reach. The chapter that established itself in the Mojave built its primary base underground. Hidden Valley was a location in the desert hills that offered concealment rather than prominence. A bunker complex beneath terrain that looked, from the surface, like nothing significant. The choice reflected the chapter's read of the Mojave's specific conditions. The territory was contested in ways that made surface presence a liability rather than a demonstration of capability. The Brotherhood in the Mojave was not the dominant force in its region, the way the Citadel had positioned itself in the capital wasteland. It was a smaller chapter, operating in a larger and more complicated political environment, and it understood that the secrecy which the California chapter's doctrine required was, in this particular landscape, also the operationally sound choice. For a period the arrangement held, the chapter conducted technology recovery operations across the desert, maintained patrols at ranges consistent with what its personnel numbers could support, and kept its profile low enough that its presence in the region was known without being fully understood by the forces operating around it. The Mojave was large. The chapter was modest in its ambitions relative to the territory's scale. The balance between those two facts provided a kind of stability that did not require the chapter to be strong, only careful. That balance did not survive the arrival of the new California Republic. The NCR had been building eastward for years before its forces reached the Mojave in significant numbers. What had begun as a survivor settlement in the California territory had grown across generations into something the post-war world had not previously produced. A functioning state with elected governance, a standing military, a currency that held value across the territory it controlled, and the institutional ambition that comes with a population large enough to require expansion simply to feed and employ itself. The NCR's eastward movement into the Mojave was not aggression in the conventional sense. It was the extension of an organization that had grown large enough that staying within its existing boundaries was itself a kind of slow crisis. The Mojave offered resources the NCR needed. Hoover Dam's hydroelectric capacity, most significantly, but also the trade routes through the desert that connected the NCR's existing territory to the east, and the agricultural and mineral resources that the Mojave's pre-war development had positioned across the region. Helios-1 was among the things the NCR wanted. A solar array capable of generating power at the scale the facility had been designed for would transform the NCR's energy infrastructure in ways that nothing else available to it could match. The Brotherhood wanted the same facility for the same fundamental reason. It was pre-war technology of significant capability, and the Brotherhood's founding doctrine described exactly this kind of asset as the reason the organization existed. Two organizations that both wanted the same thing and had no framework for sharing it produced the outcome that such situations reliably produce. The Battle of Helios-1 was not a close engagement in terms of its outcome, though it was costly in terms of what it required to reach that outcome. NCR forces in the Mojave significantly outnumbered the Brotherhood chapter that had been operating in the region. A numerical advantage in a sustained engagement compensates for equipment disadvantage in ways that the Brotherhood's doctrine had not fully incorporated into its strategic planning. Power armor and energy weapons gave Brotherhood soldiers significant advantages in the individual engagements that composed the battle. They did not give the chapter enough soldiers to hold a position against a force that could absorb its losses and continue pressing, while the Brotherhood could not. The chapter retreated to Hidden Valley, having lost a proportion of its combat personnel that no Brotherhood operation in recent memory had sustained in a single engagement. The casualties were not the only significant loss. Elder Elijah, who had led the chapter through its Mojave operations and whose combination of technical brilliance and increasingly difficult personal conduct had defined the chapter's character through the preceding years, disappeared during the retreat, not killed in the engagement as far as anyone could determine, not captured, simply gone, separated from the withdrawing forces in circumstances that the after-action accounts describe with varying levels of detail and consistent uncertainty about exactly what had happened. The chapter that sealed itself inside Hidden Valley after Helios I was commanded by Elder McNamara, who had survived the battle and who now faced a situation that nothing in the Brotherhood's history had prepared its leadership structure to manage. The lockdown that McNamara imposed was not a dramatic declaration. It was a practical assessment expressed as policy. The chapter's combat strength had been reduced to a level that made surface operations a risk the organization could not absorb further losses from. The NCR's presence in the Mojave had expanded in the period following Helios I, and the intelligence available to the chapter about NCR force disposition and intentions was limited by the fact that gathering intelligence required sending people onto a surface where the chapter's personnel numbers could not sustain additional casualties. The logical response to those conditions, the only response that did not risk accelerating the chapter's reduction toward a point where recovery became impossible, was to stop the bleeding by stopping the exposure. No one left Hidden Valley without direct authorization from McNamara's command structure. No large-scale operations were conducted on the surface. Contact with NCR-controlled territory was avoided. The chapter directed its energy inward, maintaining equipment, conducting training in the corridors and chambers of the bunker complex, sustaining the organizational functions that kept the Brotherhood's structure intact, even when that structure had nothing external to apply itself to. The bunker's air recycling systems maintained a consistent temperature, regardless of what the desert above did through the seasons, the same mechanical constancy that Lost Hills had provided in the early years after the founding. The sound of systems running because they had been built to run and had not yet been given a reason to stop. The lockdown was intended to be temporary. The duration of temporary expanded with each assessment cycle that produced the same conclusion. The chapter was not yet in a position to resume surface operations without risking losses it could not replace. Weeks became months. Months accumulated into years. The members who had joined the Mojave chapter with the expectation of active field operations found themselves drilling in underground corridors, maintaining equipment that was not being used in the field, and conducting the internal functions of a military organization that had nothing military to do. Morale was the kind of problem that institutional records rarely capture, precisely because it does not produce discrete events that documentation is designed to record. It accumulated in the daily texture of life inside a sealed space, in the conversations that people have when they have been in the same place with the same people, for longer than the situation that brought them there suggested they would need to stay. Joy in the particular friction that develops between people whose skills and training are oriented toward external action when that action is indefinitely suspended. McNamara held the lockdown in place. The reasoning behind it remained sound throughout. The human cost of the reasoning was real throughout. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and the chapter had no mechanism for resolving the tension between them except endurance. The person who arrived at Hidden Valley from the surface was not what the Brotherhood's protocols were designed to receive. The chapter's security procedures for unauthorized approach to the bunker complex reflected the lockdown's general posture. Controlled, cautious, oriented toward the assumption that anything coming from the outside was more likely to represent a threat than an opportunity. The individual who had found the location and made their way to it was a courier, someone who had been carrying a delivery across the Mojave, had been shot and left in a grave by the people who wanted what they were carrying, and had survived through a combination of circumstances that the Mojave's medical infrastructure had made possible. They had then proceeded to move through the desert with an accumulation of knowledge about its current political condition that the sealed chapter in Hidden Valley had no other means of obtaining. McNamara's assessment of the situation was practical in the way that his lockdown decision had been practical. The chapter needed information about the surface it had been cut off from. It needed specific intelligence about NCR force positions and patrol patterns. It needed the kind of operational picture that only someone moving freely through the territory could develop. The courier was moving freely through the territory. The exchange McNamara proposed was straightforward. Assistance with specific objectives the chapter needed accomplished on the surface, in return for access to the Brotherhood's knowledge and whatever other consideration the situation warranted. The deal was the Brotherhood reaching outside itself for help. It could not generate internally, a condition the founding documents had not anticipated, and that the chapter's own doctrine would have described, in better circumstances, as a sign of institutional weakness. These were not better circumstances. McNamara's willingness to make the arrangement reflected an accurate read of what the chapter's situation required. And an accurate read was more useful than a doctrinally pure position that left the chapter where it was. What the courier did with the access the Mojave's various competing factions provided, the NCR's military presence, the operation being run from the Lucky 38, the Legion's forces moving from the east, the contest over Hoover Dam that was drawing every significant power in the region toward a conclusion, determined outcomes that extended well beyond the Brotherhood's specific interests. The chapter in Hidden Valley was one piece of a much larger situation, and its survival or destruction would be determined by decisions made in that larger context, rather than by anything the chapter could control from underground. Elijah had not died at Helios 1. The chapter at Hidden Valley did not know this with certainty, but the absence of confirmed death in the after-action accounts left the question open in the way that unresolved questions persist, not answered, not dismissed, occupying a space in the chapter's awareness that could not be closed without information the chapter did not have. What had actually happened to the former elder was not recoverable from Hidden Valley's sealed position. Elijah had moved through the Mojave after the retreat, following an obsession that had been developing through the later years of his leadership, and that the pressures of Helios 1 had not interrupted but accelerated. The Sierra Madre was a pre-war resort complex, a construction of extraordinary pre-war luxury built in the mountains west of the desert, sealed inside a toxic atmospheric cloud that made approach lethal without specific protective equipment, and carrying within its sealed environment technology that Elijah had become convinced represented something beyond what the Brotherhood's conventional recovery operations had ever reached, a device he believed capable of functioning as a weapon of civilization-ending scale, something that could, in his assessment, be used to reset the conditions of the post-war world according to a design of his choosing. What the trajectory of Elijah's thinking represented was the Brotherhood's core belief extended past the point where any other value could constrain it. Technology was the most important thing. Technology could solve any problem. Technology in the hands of someone with the knowledge to use it correctly was sufficient justification for whatever was required to obtain it. That reasoning, held without the friction that institutional deliberation or other people's disagreement provides, had carried a brilliant man to a location where the technology he intended to weaponize had instead trapped him. A fate that the people who might have intervened were not positioned to know about and could not have addressed if they had. His absence from the chapter had shaped the organization he left behind in ways that his presence would not have. A different elder, with a different set of convictions, had made the lockdown decision. A different chapter, smaller, more cautious, more inward-looking, had developed in the years since Helios I than would have developed under his continued direction. Whether that chapter was better or worse, positioned for what followed, was a calculation that depended entirely on what following meant in the specific circumstances the Mojave was moving toward. The Brotherhood chapter in Hidden Valley existed during the period when the Mojave's competing forces were moving toward their confrontation at Hoover Dam, in a condition that had no precedent in the organization's history. It was not destroyed. It had not been absorbed. It had not formally dissolved or formally surrendered. It was present, maintaining its structure, its chain of command, its equipment, its ranks, in a bunker beneath the desert, dependent for its continuation on decisions being made by people who were not Brotherhood members and who had no institutional obligation to the organization's survival. The chapter's fate was genuinely outside its own control in the most complete sense that had ever applied to any Brotherhood operation. In some accounts of the period, the chapter survived. The lockdown ended. McNamara's leadership was confirmed or replaced. The chapter re-emerged onto the Mojave's surface with reduced strength but intact organization, and the Brotherhood's presence in the desert continued in a diminished but functional form. In others, the chapter's location was compromised, and NCR forces moved against it, with results that the chapter's reduced strength could not resist. In still others, internal leadership transitions produced a different direction and different outcomes. As the range of what was possible reflected the extent to which the chapter's situation had moved beyond the Brotherhood's institutional capacity to determine its own future. An organization founded on the principle that technology and discipline were sufficient to address any challenge had arrived at a position where neither its technology nor its discipline could resolve what it was facing. The NCR that had broken the chapter at Helios I had not used superior weapons to do it. It had used numbers, organizational depth, supply infrastructure, and the practical advantages that a democratic state with a large population could bring to a sustained military engagement that a sealed underground chapter could not match, regardless of the quality of its individual soldiers' equipment. Better armed had not meant stronger. The distinction between those two things, which the Brotherhood's founding doctrine had not drawn clearly enough, had been demonstrated at a cost that the chapter would carry for as long as it continued to exist. The desert above Hidden Valley moved through its seasons without reference to what was happening beneath it. The heat that built through the long days, the cold that replaced it after dark, the wind that crossed the open ground with the patient consistency of something that had been doing this since before anyone in the bunker below had been born, and would continue doing it after the last of them was gone. The Citadel, after Lyons, was a different place than it had been during his tenure, in the way that institutions are always different after the person who defined them is gone. The physical structure was unchanged. The reinforced walls of the old Pentagon still rose above the capital wasteland with the same solidity they had maintained through decades of super-mutant engagements and the Enclave campaign that had ended with Project Purity running, and the Brotherhood's chapter reduced to a fraction of what it had been when Lyons first established his base inside those walls. The training areas still functioned. The scribe research facilities still operated. The night maintenance workshops still processed the equipment that Brotherhood soldiers carried into the field. The institutional machinery was intact in all the ways that machinery can be intact when the person who understood what it was for is no longer present to direct it. Sarah Lyons had been the chapter's most capable combat officer, and the person whose combination of operational record and personal authority made her the natural continuation of her father's leadership. The Eastern Chapter's senior members had understood this without needing to deliberate about it extensively. Her death, following her father's, by a period short enough that the chapter had not fully processed the first loss before it was managing the second, to remove the succession that had made the transition appear manageable and replaced it with a vacuum that the chapter's thinned senior ranks were not well positioned to fill. The outcast split years earlier had taken the members most committed to traditional doctrine. The super-mutant campaigns and the Enclave engagement had reduced the Paladin tier's experienced leadership through casualties that had been replaced at the lower ranks, but not fully at the senior levels where strategic decisions were made. What remained was a chapter with functional operational capacity and an absence at its top that the existing Elder Council structure, thin from the same attrition that had thinned everything else, could not address through its normal deliberative process. The vacuum did not last as long as the chapter's internal condition suggested it might. Arthur Maxson had grown up inside the Citadel's walls. He had arrived there as a child, placed in the Eastern Chapter's care through arrangements connected to his lineage, a direct descendant of the man whose refusal at a California desert facility had produced everything the Brotherhood had become in the 2 centuries since. Growing up inside an institution is a different experience than joining one from outside, and the culture that the Citadel's specific version of Brotherhood life had produced in him was layered in ways that were not immediately visible in his operational record. He had absorbed Lyons Chapter's particular character, its commitment to the capital wastelands communities, its willingness to operate at the boundary of established doctrine, through daily proximity to the people who practiced it. He had also absorbed the founding documents, the rank structure, the technological philosophy, and the entire institutional history of the Brotherhood through the education that the Citadel provided to its members, regardless of their age when they arrived. His field record was not theoretical. Engagements that the chapter's after-action reports noted for outcomes beyond what the assigned forces would have been expected to produce had his name attached to them. The specific instance that circulated most widely among the chapter's members involved a super-mutant known as Schlog, an individual whose size and aggression had made it a persistent problem in a section of the capital wasteland's ruined territory. Maxson had addressed the situation in a manner that the after-action documentation described in operational language, and that the soldiers who had been present described in terms that operational language did not quite capture. He was young when the chapter's senior members recognized that he was what the vacuum required, younger than any elder in the Brotherhood's recorded history. The recognition was not sentimental. The chapter was not organized around sentiment, but it was not purely rational either. Leadership requires something beyond documented qualifications, and the chapter's senior members, assessing the situation with the practical orientation that the Brotherhood trained into everyone who spent enough time inside it, identified that something in him and acted on the identification. He became elder of the Eastern Brotherhood chapter, while the chapter's records of Owen Lyon's tenure were still being fully compiled by the scribes. The decisions that followed his assumption of command were not immediately dramatic in their external expression, but their cumulative effect on the chapter's character was substantial. The cooperative relationships that Lyons had built with communities across the capital wasteland, the arrangements through which the Brotherhood's presence translated into security commitments and mutual resource access, were not eliminated but restructured. The Brotherhood would continue operating in the region. It would continue engaging the threats that its military capability was suited to address. What it would not do was define its organizational purpose around the needs of the population it operated among. Technology collection and preservation was the mission the founding documents described. Maxson moved the chapter back toward that description with the consistency of someone who had decided that the direction was correct and was not interested in the argument against it. Military discipline across all tiers was tightened in ways that the chapter under Lyons had allowed to relax in the direction of the more flexible culture his humanitarian commitments had required. Recruitment expanded. The chapter needed personnel, and Maxson was willing to accept outsiders into the initiate tier at a pace that the California chapter's traditional standards would not have sanctioned. But the culture those recruits entered was harder and more hierarchical than the one Lyons had maintained. New members were not joining an organization that saw itself as part of the wasteland around it. They were joining one that saw itself as distinct from that wasteland and operating within it according to its own purposes. The Western Brotherhood's Elder Council, which had maintained communication with the Capital Wasteland chapter through the Lyons years, with the particular combination of awareness and limited practical influence that distance imposed, she received the reports of Maxson's changes, with responses that the scribes catalogued as notably different in tone from what had characterized the council's correspondence with Lyons. Recognition was the dominant quality. The Eastern chapter was becoming, again, something the Western organization could place within its own understanding of what the Brotherhood was. Whether the communities of the capital wasteland shared that sense of recognition was a question the council's correspondence did not address, because the council's correspondence was not directed at those communities. The grey morning light over the citadel came in at angles that changed through the seasons. Lower in winter, higher in summer, always filtered through the atmospheric conditions that 2 centuries of post-war chemistry had produced in the air above the Eastern Territory. The intelligence picture that Maxson's expanded apparatus had been developing pointed northeast. The Commonwealth, the ruins of the greater Boston area, the territory that pre-war maps had designated Massachusetts, was known to the Brotherhood primarily through the reports of scouts and travelers, whose accounts of the region had accumulated in the scribes' files over the years. What those accounts described was a wasteland with the particular character of a place where advanced pre-war research infrastructure had been concentrated, and where the post-war transformation had produced conditions that differed from the capital wasteland and the Mojave in ways that the Brotherhood's operational experience had not fully prepared it to assess. The Institute was the specific intelligence priority. An organization operating from an underground facility whose location had not been fixed by any external observer was believed to be producing synthetic humans, manufactured beings whose physical and behavioral characteristics were indistinguishable from those of biological people, at a scale and level of sophistication that represented the most advanced technological development anywhere in the post-war world. The Brotherhood's assessment of what this meant was framed entirely within its established doctrine. Synthetic humans were a category of technology. The technology was dangerous, not because of any quality inherent to the individual synths, but because the capacity to produce them represented a level of biological and mechanical engineering that, in the hands of an organization operating without external oversight or accountability, was the kind of threat that the Brotherhood's founding purpose had been designed to address. The Institute also produced other technology, conventional equipment at a level of refinement that nothing else in the post-war world approached. The combination of what the Brotherhood's doctrine identified as a threat and what it identified as a recovery priority made the Commonwealth a destination that Maxson's assessment process was always going to reach. The authorization for the Commonwealth campaign moved through the chapter's command structure with less deliberation than the Eastern expeditions of previous generations had required, partly because the chapter's structure was now organized around Maxson's direction in ways that the Elder Council of the Lions' years had not been organized around Lions, and partly because the intelligence case was strong enough that the counter-argument required a commitment to doctrinal caution that the chapter's current culture did not strongly support. The Pridwin had been under construction for years. Nothing in the Commonwealth had prepared its inhabitants for what appeared in the sky above them. The airship was the product of scribe engineering, a night fabrication applied across a period long enough that the people who had begun the project were not all present to see it completed. Its scale was not something that verbal description from the travelers who had seen it under construction had adequately conveyed to anyone who had not. It blocked portions of the sky above the ruined Boston area in the way that large structures blocked the sky, not by being dramatic about it, simply by being there, present, and enormous, its shadow moving across the ground below as it positioned itself above the territory the Brotherhood had come to operate in. Maxson understood what the Pridwin's arrival communicated to everyone in the region who looked up and saw it. An organization that could build and operate an airship of that scale was not an organization that could be ignored, dismissed, or addressed. Through the kind of low-level friction that wasteland factions applied to each other in territorial disputes, the arrival was a statement before it was an operation. Every faction in the Commonwealth received that statement simultaneously, without the Brotherhood needing to deliver it individually. Brotherhood forces deployed from the Pridwin to the ground below established positions with the efficiency of a chapter that had been preparing for this specific deployment through months of planning. Supply lines between the airship and the ground operations were functional from the first days. The chapter's presence in the Commonwealth was not tentative. It was established, organized, and oriented toward the objectives that had brought it north. The factions the Brotherhood encountered in the Commonwealth had been operating in a political environment that the Institute's existence had shaped without any of them fully understanding how. The railroad operated through a network of contacts and safe locations, rather than a fixed base, a structure designed for concealment in an environment where the Institute's capacity to infiltrate any community with synthetic replacements meant that visible organization was a vulnerability. Its members believed that the synthetic humans the Institute produced were people in every meaningful sense, and that the Brotherhood's description of those beings as dangerous technology was a position that only an institution which had never considered the question carefully could hold. The Brotherhood's response to this argument, when it encountered it, was to note that the argument was outside the scope of the chapter's operational mandate and proceed with the mission. The Minutemen were a different kind of problem, not ideologically opposed to the Brotherhood, but not aligned with it either. committed to the survival of Commonwealth settlements in ways that made their cooperation contingent on how the Brotherhood's operations affected those settlements. The chapter engaged them with the same operational pragmatism it applied to every external relationship, useful where useful, set aside where not. The Institute itself was the target, and locating it required the combination of intelligence gathering, territorial operation, and the kind of information access that the Commonwealth's complicated political landscape made available to a chapter willing to work through it. The underground facility's position was eventually fixed. The assault planning that followed applied the Brotherhood's accumulated experience of taking defended locations, the Mariposa assault, the Enclave campaign at the Jefferson Memorial, to the specific conditions of the Commonwealth's terrain and the Institute's particular defensive architecture. Liberty Prime made the journey from the capital wasteland to the Commonwealth for its second deployment in Brotherhood history. The scribes who had maintained it since the Enclave campaign documented the preparation required to move it and reposition it for operational use, with the thoroughness they applied to everything the Brotherhood considered significant enough to preserve. The Institute's underground facility was breached in an operation that combined the Pridwin's aerial support, Liberty Prime's ground-clearing capability, and the Brotherhood's Paladin units moving through the Institute's internal structure with the close quarters experience that the Capital Wasteland campaign had developed over years of urban engagement. The fighting inside the facility was conducted against defenders whose technological resources matched or exceeded what the Brotherhood's soldiers carried, a condition that the Mariposa assault had also produced, but that the intervening engagements had not, and that reminded the Paladin units moving through the Institute's corridors that capability advantage is not a constant. The chapter sustained losses in the assault. The operation did not stop. The Institute's synth production infrastructure was destroyed. Its research operations were ended. The facility itself did not survive the conclusion of the assault in a condition that would permit resumed operation. The most technologically sophisticated organization the post-war world had produced ceased to exist as a functioning entity in the hours of that engagement. The Brotherhood's after-action assessment noted the campaign's objectives and their achievement with the precision that the scribes brought to documentation of significant operations. What the assessment also noted, and what the chapter's command structure had not fully anticipated when the Commonwealth campaign was authorized, was the condition of what remained after the Institute fell. The Commonwealth's political landscape had been organized in ways none of its factions had entirely understood around the Institute's presence. The railroad, to whatever extent it had survived the campaign's various engagements, had lost the primary context that defined its existence. The Minutemen were present and active, and not incorporated into any structure the Brotherhood controlled. The territory was not pacified in the sense that completing the campaign's stated objective had produced a stable environment. It was simply a wasteland from which the most significant organized technological threat had been removed, which left it a wasteland with all the complications that wasted land produces. The Pridwin maintained its position above the ruins of Boston. The chapter on the ground below continued its operations. Brotherhood soldiers moved through the Commonwealth's territory in formations that the region's surviving communities observed with the same complicated awareness that wasteland communities had always brought to the Brotherhood's presence. The recognition that the organization above them was powerful, organized, and pursuing objectives that it had defined without consulting the people most directly affected by the pursuit. The Institute's destruction had been the mission. The mission was accomplished. What the Commonwealth was now, with the Institute gone, and the Brotherhood present, and the question of what came next unanswered by any of the documents that had authorized the campaign. That was the situation the chapter was left managing from the deck of an airship, above a territory it had committed to, but not resolved. Power. The Brotherhood's history kept demonstrating in different locations and different eras was the part that could be built. What to do with it once it existed was the part that the founding documents had never fully addressed, and that each generation had been required to answer again with whatever the specific circumstances of their moment provided. The ruins of Boston spread in every direction below the Pridwin's shadow. The chapter held what it had taken. The question of what holding it meant was, as it had always been, still open. The mountains of Appalachia received the Brotherhood the way mountains receive everything, without acknowledgement, without adjustment, without any modification of the conditions they had maintained since long before the war, and would maintain long after whatever the Brotherhood intended to accomplish in them was finished. The detachment that arrived in the region of what had been West Virginia in the years immediately following the Great War was small by the standards of every other Brotherhood deployment that history had recorded. No fleet of airships, no hundreds of members carrying the equipment and personnel depth of a chapter designed for sustained independent operation. A modest force, led by a paladin who had come to the Brotherhood through a path that most of its members had not traveled, entering territory that the organization's California-based records described with the particular thinness of documentation about places that pre-war federal infrastructure had reached but never prioritized. Elizabeth Taggarty had been a United States Army Ranger before she was Brotherhood. That sequence mattered in ways that shaped everything the Appalachian chapter became under her direction. She had not grown up inside the organization's institutional culture the way that hereditary members had, not absorbed its philosophical framework through the daily proximity of people who had been born into it and would die. Inside it, she had joined it as an adult, with a fully formed understanding of what military service required and a set of convictions about what that service was, for that predated her contact with the Brotherhood's founding documents. What the Brotherhood offered her was a structure and a mission she could commit to. What she brought to it was a pragmatism that the institutional culture had not produced and would not have produced on its own. The radio connection to Lost Hills was real, but limited in what it could provide. Distances of that scale, across terrain that the war had left with its own interference patterns, meant that communication was possible in the sense that transmissions moved between the two locations, not possible in the sense that the back and forth of genuine operational guidance could happen at the pace that field conditions required. Taggarty made decisions because decisions needed to be made, and the rate at which the Appalachian situation demanded them was faster than the rate at which Lost Hills could be consulted and respond. The mountains around the chapter's initial positions rose through morning fog with the consistency of geography that does not register human presence as a variable worth accounting for. The threat that defined the Appalachian chapter's entire existence was not one that any Brotherhood doctrine had anticipated. The scorch beasts were large, the scale of pre-war military aircraft in their wingspan, fast enough in the air that Brotherhood soldiers on open ground had limited options for positioning once one was actively engaged with them, and carrying in their biology a contagion that transformed what it infected in ways that the FEV program at Mariposa had produced through deliberate engineering. The scorched plague was not a weapon in the sense that FEV had been a weapon. It was something that had emerged from the specific conditions of Appalachia's post-war underground, the mining operations that had been running beneath the mountains before the war, the particular combination of pre-war experimental material and post-war radiation and geological conditions that the bombs had not created but had accelerated into producing something that would not have existed on the schedule. Nature alone would have set. Humans who were exposed to the contagion through scorch-beast contact became scorched. The transformation was not subtle. Black markings spread across the skin, cognition reduced to the patterns of something that was no longer making decisions in any conventional sense. The individual who had existed before exposure continued to exist in physical form, walking, reacting to stimuli, moving through the landscape, but as a vector for further transmission rather than as a person. The communities that the Brotherhood encountered in the surrounding territory were not being attacked by the scorched and the scorch beasts in the way that communities are attacked by raiders or hostile factions. They were being consumed steadily, without strategic intent, by a biological process that did not have an agenda and did not stop when it had taken enough. The scale of what was moving through Appalachia was beyond what the detachment's numbers could address through direct engagement alone. Taggady understood this within weeks of the chapter's arrival, and recorded her understanding in the operational logs that the chapter maintained with Brotherhood thoroughness, even in conditions that made thoroughness difficult. The documentation that accumulated in those logs across the chapter's years in the mountains would eventually become some of the most detailed records of the Scorched Plague's early development that the post-war world produced, not because the chapter had been sent to produce such records, but because the Brotherhood trained its members to document what they encountered, and Taggady's people did that, even when what they were encountering was destroying them. The responders had organized around the things that emergency service workers organize around when the emergency becomes permanent. Former firefighters, paramedics, police officers, and the volunteers who had affiliated with those services before the war had found each other in the months after the exchange and built a community structured around the principles their pre-war roles had given them: mutual aid, medical care, the systematic response to crises that trained people provide to communities that need it. They had established themselves across Appalachian territory with the particular effectiveness of people whose skills were precisely what the post-war situation required, and who had enough organizational experience to apply those skills collectively rather than individually. The Free States were a different kind of organization. People whose pre-war political convictions had led them to build private bunkers and prepare for exactly the kind of governmental collapse the war had produced. Their survival had been more complete than most groups in the region, precisely because they had anticipated the need to survive independently. Their resources included technical expertise and pre-war equipment that the Brotherhood needed, and their attitude toward any organization that presented itself with military structure and institutional authority was the attitude of people who had spent years convinced that such organizations were the problem rather than the solution. Taggady engaged both groups because the chapter's situation left no operational basis for the Brotherhood's traditional posture of separation from wasteland communities. This was not a philosophical choice in the sense that Owen Lyon's decision in the capital wasteland had been a philosophical choice, a deliberate departure from established doctrine based on a moral assessment of what the imminative ease-die circumstances required. It was a practical choice in the sense that a chapter with the Appalachian Detachment's personnel numbers and the Scorched Plague scale could either work with whatever organized groups existed in the territory or conduct operations with a resource base that was insufficient for the threat it was facing. The relationships that developed through those engagements were not uniformly comfortable. The Free State's suspicion of military organizations was not irrational, given the history that had produced the war, and the Brotherhood's institutional habits, the assumption of authority, the expectation that knowledge flowed toward the organization rather than away from it, created friction with groups that had their own structures and their own sense of what cooperation required. The work of maintaining those alliances through the operational demands of an active campaign against the Scorched took sustained attention that the chapter's personnel could not always spare. The chapter managed it anyway, because it had to. Fighting scorch beasts in open terrain was an education in the specific ways that Brotherhood tactical doctrine had been developed for conditions that the Appalachian Mountains did not provide. Power armor performed the way it always performed, absorbing damage that would have ended an unprotected soldier, providing the physical capability enhancement that made Brotherhood soldiers more effective than their numbers suggested. What power armor could not do was make a soldier airborne, and a scorch beast, fighting from altitude against targets on the ground, had options that the ground-based target's equipment could not neutralize through conventional engagement positioning. The creatures were fast enough that the window for effective fire solutions was shorter than engagements with ground-based threats. They were large enough that the shots that connected required follow-through that the Brotherhood's energy weapons could provide, but that the movement of the engagement often complicated. Taggady adapted the chapter's approach through the same mechanism that military organizations have always used to adapt the accumulation of outcomes across repeated engagements, assessed against what the engagements were supposed to produce and modified based on the difference. The local knowledge that the chapter's alliances had provided was not tactical knowledge in the formal sense, but it was geographic knowledge, and geographic knowledge in mountain terrain translates into tactical advantage if the people applying it understand the translation. Choke points where Scorch Beast flight approaches were constrained by the terrain. Defensive positions where the chapter's fire solutions were better than the creature's angle of attack. Engagement timing that used the landscape's specific features rather than fighting against them. The campaigns that developed from these adaptations were not victories in the sense of engagements with clear, decisive outcomes. They were pressure applications, sustained, costly, incrementally effective in ways that the casualty numbers did not make immediately apparent, but that the long-term assessment of Scorch Beast population density in contested areas eventually confirmed. The seasons in the Appalachian Highlands moved through their full-range winters that came early and stayed long. Springs that produced a particular quality of green in the forest cover that the mountains maintained even through the post-war transformation of the surrounding lowlands. The sounds of rain on structures that had been built to withstand rather than to comfort. Brotherhood members lost in the Scorch Beast campaigns were recorded with the notation that the organization applied to all its casualties: rank, assignment, circumstances, date. The list grew longer through each operational season without the chapter's overall strength growing in a corresponding proportion. The Scorch Beasts reproduced faster than the chapter could reduce the breeding population through direct engagement alone. Atlas Observatory sat in the Appalachian Highlands, with the particular presence of a pre-war facility that had been built for observation and had found itself, in the post-war period, being observed more than it was observing anything. The Brotherhood established it as its primary base of operations in the region, large enough to house the chapter's command functions and support operations, positioned with access to the long-range communication equipment that connected the chapter to Lost Hills and to whatever intelligence the chapter's alliances in the surrounding territory could provide. The scribes who maintained Atlas documented the facility's systems and the information that moved through them, with the same careful attention they brought to documentation of everything else. The strategic problem that the Atlas-based planning sessions kept returning to was the same problem that direct engagement with Scorch Beasts had demonstrated across the chapter's operational history in the region. The breeding population was the source, and addressing individual Scorch Beasts in field engagements, while the breeding population remained intact, was a strategy that could be sustained indefinitely without producing a conclusion. The mathematics of attrition ran against the chapter in that framework. Something that addressed the source rather than the symptoms was required. The nuclear silos still active in Appalachian territory represented that kind of solution. A strike on the Scorch Beast Queen's primary nesting location, the breeding center from which the population that was consuming the region's communities continued to expand, could damage the reproductive capacity of the threat at a level that field engagements could not reach. The technical requirements for accessing those silos were considerable. The pre-war security systems were functional, designed to resist unauthorized access by methods that included force, and the authorization codes required to work through them legitimately were held in pre-war channels that the post-war world had no simple mechanism to access. The Brotherhood committed resources to this problem. that it could not easily spare from the direct operational demands the scorched campaign was generating. Taggarty's personal logs from this period are recorded in a tone that the scribes who later compiled them noted as distinct from her earlier entries, more deliberate in phrasing, more attentive to the weight of individual sentences. She was aware that the solution being pursued involved weapons whose previous use had produced the world the chapter was currently fighting to protect. That awareness did not produce a different conclusion about what needed to be done. It produced a quality of attention to what doing it would mean that the logs preserved even when the entries themselves were brief. The radio went silent during the period when the chapter needed it most. The long-range connection to Lost Hills had never been reliable enough to serve as real operational guidance, but it had served as evidence of connection, the confirmation that the organization, which had sent the Appalachian detachment east, was aware of the detachment's existence and the situation it was managing. When that connection stopped producing responses, the confirmation it had provided disappeared with it. The reasons for the silence were administrative from Lost Hills' perspective: internal transitions, resource reallocation, the reduced priority that a distant chapter with limited communication capacity received when the California organization was managing its own demands. From the Appalachian chapter's position, inside mountains fighting a biological catastrophe with dwindling personnel and no resupply, the silence communicated something different. It communicated that the chapter was alone in the complete sense, not the partial sense of operating at a distance from institutional support, but the total sense of operating without institutional support, without institutional awareness, without anyone outside the region knowing whether the chapter still existed. Taggarty's logs from this period do not record panic or accusation. They record assessment, the chapter's current strength, the operational status of the equipment remaining functional, the state of the alliances the chapter had built with the responders and the free states, and the degree to which those alliances could sustain the ongoing campaign without Brotherhood resources that were no longer available to contribute. The probability, calculated with the same precision she brought to tactical assessments, of the chapter reaching the operational objective before the chapter's personnel numbers fell below the threshold required to continue. She understood that the threshold might be reached before the objective was. She continued the campaign anyway. The end of the Appalachian chapter did not arrive in a single engagement that the historical record could locate with precision. It arrived the way that the end of a depleted organization arrives through the accumulation of losses across a period long enough that the remaining personnel were no longer sufficient to conduct the operations, the mission, required, even as the individuals among them continued to conduct whatever operations their numbers permitted. Taggarty was lost in a major engagement during the campaign's later stages. The specific circumstances recorded by the few members who survived the engagement, with enough subsequent functional time to write them down. The records from that period are fragmentary in ways that records from periods of organizational collapse tend to be. What the chapter left behind was distributed across Appalachia in the way that the remains of active operations are distributed when those operations end without orderly withdrawal. Bases, equipment caches, the accumulated documentation that Brotherhood scribes produced, even under the conditions the Appalachian campaign had subjected them to. Records of the scorched plague's behavior across the years of the chapter's engagement with it, that contained more detailed information about the contagion's patterns than existed anywhere else in the post-war world. The scorched war, in the accounting that later observers would apply to it, was not one. The plague continued in the region beyond the chapter's operational period. The scorched beast population was reduced from what it would have been without the Brotherhood's campaign. The damage, inflicted across years of grinding, seasonal fighting, had cumulative effect that the chapter had not survived to observe, but it was not eliminated. Decades after the last Appalachian Brotherhood soldier's final entry in the chapter's logs, The inhabitants of Vault 76 emerged into the mountains and found the ruins of what Tagadi's people had built and fought for, and ultimately been consumed by. The equipment was still there in varying states of preservation. The records were still there in the facilities whose environmental controls had kept them from complete deterioration. The bases were still there, emptied of the people who had established them and maintained across the intervening decades by nothing except the structural quality of what the Brotherhood's knights had built when they had the materials and personnel to build things properly. The chapter had fought without recognition from the organization that had sent it. It had continued fighting after that organization stopped communicating with it. It had sustained its campaign past the point where the campaign was clearly winnable, because the alternative to continuing was not available to people trained the way Tagadi's people had been trained. What that said about the Brotherhood, about the institution's capacity to produce commitment that outlasted the institutional support those committed people were owed, was a question that the mountains did not answer, and the records only partially preserved. The forests of Appalachia grew back across the years, as forests do, covering the evidence of what had happened in them with the patient indifference of living things that do not measure time in institutional terms. 2.5 centuries after the founding march reached Lost Hills, the Brotherhood was still there. That fact alone, the simple persistence of the organization across a span of time that had eliminated every other institution the pre-war world had produced, was the most significant thing about the Brotherhood's presence in the ruins of Greater Los Angeles by 2296. Governments had collapsed. Corporations had dissolved into the landscape they had helped destroy. Military structures had either transformed into something unrecognizable or ceased to exist entirely. The Brotherhood had done neither. It had fractured, contracted, nearly disappeared in certain regions, lost entire chapters to distances and disasters that the organization at Lost Hills had not been able to address. And it was still present, still structured, still operating according to a hierarchy and a set of principles that traced a direct line back to the documents drafted in the bunker that a group of soldiers had walked into more than 2 centuries earlier. The chapter, operating in the Los Angeles territory by the mid-2290s, held the full institutional structure that the founding had established. Scribes catalogued and researched. Knights maintained equipment and managed the physical infrastructure of the chapter's operations. Paladins conducted field operations and held the command positions that the chapter's chain of authority ran through. Initiates occupied the entry tier, working toward the demonstrated competence that advancement required. The ranks functioned as they had always functioned, not as titles that people held without operational meaning, but as actual descriptions of role and responsibility within an organization that had survived long enough to make its structure genuinely institutional rather than aspirational. From the outside, the chapter projected the image of dominance. Paladins in full power armor moving through the Los Angeles ruins communicated a level of organized military capability that no other force in the region could match in individual soldier terms. The chapter's supply lines connected outposts across territory that most communities in the area navigated with considerably less certainty about what they would find at any given point along the route. The Brotherhood's visible presence in the region was substantial enough that the populations living within its operational area understood its existence as a fixed feature of the landscape, rather than a temporary condition. The internal reality of managing that presence was less straightforward than its external appearance suggested. The institutional culture that the Brotherhood's rank structure produced was not abstract in the way that organizational cultures described from outside often appear. The protocols governing power armor were specific and enforced. Who was authorized to wear a suit, under what operational conditions, and through what process of demonstrated qualification? These were not questions that individual members resolved through personal preference or situational judgment. They were determined by the chapter's command structure according to standards that the founding documents had established, and that each generation of Brotherhood leadership had maintained and in some cases tightened. The armor was not equipment in the casual sense of a tool that anyone with sufficient physical capability could pick up and use. It was the Brotherhood's most significant material expression of what the organization was preserved, maintained, earned, and operated according to a discipline that distinguished the people inside it from every other armed group in the wasteland. The chain of command that moved orders through the chapter's structure produced the particular texture of authority that real hierarchies produce, the friction of institutional process applied to operational decisions, the compliance that people trained inside a structure give to that structure's direction, even when individual judgment might suggest a different course. The accumulation of small decisions made at lower levels of authority that shaped outcomes at higher levels, without the higher levels always being fully aware of the shaping. The Brotherhood's command structure in the Los Angeles territory was not a simplified version of what the founding documents had described. It was a functioning implementation of it, operating with all the complexity that genuine implementation produces. The chapter's relationship to its own history was present in how its members understood and described their role. The founding, the principles, the campaigns and fractures of the preceding 2 centuries, these were not distant institutional mythology in the way that founding stories become mythology in organizations old enough to have lost living connection to their origins. They were active reference points in the deliberations through which the chapter's leadership justified its decisions. The founding documents were cited, the precedents established by significant decisions in the Brotherhood's past were invoked. The organization's history was not merely decorative, it was operational, providing the framework within which current decisions were located and assessed. The light in the Los Angeles territory had a particular quality in the hours after dawn. The marine layer that the pre-war coast had produced still formed in the post-war atmosphere, diffusing the early sun into something softer and more even than the direct light of midday, illuminating the ruins below with the kind of illumination that makes distances uncertain. Cold fusion was not a technology that the Brotherhood had been pursuing before the specific intelligence that directed the chapter's operational focus toward it. The concept existed in the organization's pre-war research documentation, a theoretical approach to energy generation that the pre-war scientific community had not succeeded in implementing at practical scale before. The exchange ended the research programs working on it. Energy generation at the scale that cold fusion represented, clean, sustained, not dependent on the fuel sources that the resource wars had been fought over, would alter the post-war balance of capability more completely than almost any other single technological development. The entity in possession of a working cold fusion system would hold an advantage over every other organized force in the wasteland that dwarfed the advantage that power armor and energy weapons provided. The Brotherhood's operational response to intelligence, indicating that a working cold fusion implementation existed, was entirely consistent with the founding doctrine as it had been practiced across 2 centuries. The technology needed to be in Brotherhood hands. The chapter deployed field units, developed information through the intelligence methodology that the organization's operational history had refined, and engaged with outside parties, where engagement produced access to relevant information. The operation proceeded according to established Brotherhood procedure. What the operation revealed, as it developed, was that the Brotherhood was not the only sophisticated actor working toward the same objective, and that the other actors pursuing it were operating with a historical depth and institutional complexity that the Brotherhood's intelligence apparatus had not fully mapped. Voltec's surviving organizational presence had interests in cold fusion technology that had been developing across a timeline longer than the Brotherhood's awareness of the technology as an operational priority. The Brotherhood was moving through a competitive intelligence environment that it understood less completely than its operational confidence suggested. An organization that had spent 2 centuries assuming it was the most significant force shaping the wasteland's technological future was discovering that other forces had been shaping it for longer, more deliberately, and with a clearer picture of what they were working toward. The new California Republic's absence from the Western wasteland was a condition so significant that understanding the Brotherhood's position in 2296 required understanding what that absence had created. The NCR had been the largest organized governmental structure the post-war world had produced west of the Mississippi. Its destruction, not through the gradual institutional erosion that had ended most pre-war governmental successor attempts, but through a deliberate detonation that removed the city of Shady Sands from the landscape with the kind of finality that nuclear weapons produce, had eliminated the Brotherhood's primary strategic counterweight in the Cound region, the organization that had driven the Hidden Valley chapter underground at Helios I, that had competed with the Brotherhood for influence and resources across the Western wasteland for generations, that had represented an alternative vision of what post-war civilization could become, was gone. The Brotherhood that remained in the NCR's absence was one of the largest coherent forces in the Western Territory. The vacuum that the NCR's removal had created was not filled by any other organized structure with comparable scale or institutional depth. Smaller factions occupied portions of the territory the NCR had controlled. Communities that had operated within the NCR's governance framework were managing without it through whatever local arrangements they could construct. The landscape of organized power in the West had been simplified dramatically, and the simplification had moved the Brotherhood from the position of one significant force among several to something closer to the dominant organized presence in the region. What the chapter did with that position was not a question the founding documents had been written to answer. Becoming a governing authority had never been part of the Brotherhood's self-description. Technology preservation, military capability, institutional coherence, these were what the organization had always said it was for. Governance of a wasteland territory was something different, requiring a relationship to the population being governed that the Brotherhood's doctrine had consistently resisted. The chapter held more ground than it could comfortably manage, and projected more certainty about its direction than its internal deliberations supported. The question of what the Brotherhood was doing with the power it now held was one that the chapter's leadership was aware of and had not resolved. The wasteland communities living within its operational area were aware of it too, with the particular awareness of people whose lives were shaped by decisions made in an institution they had no access to. The conspiracy that Vault-Tec had been running since before the war was not something the Brotherhood had been positioned to observe clearly. The organization that had built the Vault system, the corporate structure that had turned the pre-war government's nuclear survival program into something else entirely, something oriented toward controlling the conditions of the post-war world's development, according to a design that the people being controlled were not meant to know about, had been operating on a timeline and at a level of institutional depth that the Brotherhood's intelligence methodology was not configured to penetrate. The Brotherhood collected technology, it assessed threats, it conducted military operations against enemies that its doctrine defined as enemies. The kind of long-running, multi-generational social engineering that Vault-Tec's surviving structure had been implementing was not the kind of thing that the Brotherhood's operational framework was built to detect. The institutional critique that this situation represented was pointed in ways that the Brotherhood itself was not positioned to fully appreciate. An organization that had spent 2 centuries accumulating advanced technology and limiting its distribution to people the Brotherhood deemed qualified to use it had, in effect, contributed to the conditions that the Vault-Tec conspiracy required. A wasteland where advanced knowledge was concentrated in one institution and unavailable to the broader population was a wasteland where the information necessary to understand what was being done to it was correspondingly concentrated. The Brotherhood's hoarding was not intentional participation in the conspiracy. It was something more uncomfortable, unintentional service to objectives it had never chosen and would not have chosen if they had been presented to it directly. An organization shaped by forces it could not see, serving purposes it had not selected, remained in that condition, partly because its confidence in its own understanding of the wasteland was large enough that the gaps in that understanding were not visible from inside it. New Vegas received the Brotherhood's return with the particular quality of a city that has a long memory and keeps it. The losses at Helios 1 were part of the Brotherhood's institutional history in the Mojave documented, filed, carried forward in the organizational memory that the scribes maintained across the chapter's various records. The years of underground existence in Hidden Valley afterward, the near extinction of the chapter that had operated in the desert, the dependency on outside decisions that had characterized the Mojave Brotherhood's survival or destruction, all of it was known to the organization operating in the New Vegas theater in the years following Season 2's timeline. The return to a city where the Brotherhood's previous presence had ended in strategic retreat was not a triumphant re-entry. It was a careful repositioning by an organization that understood, from its own history in the region, that the Mojave did not reward overconfidence. Mr. House had been in New Vegas longer than the Brotherhood had existed. The pre-war entrepreneur who had built the city's entertainment infrastructure and survived in a life support system inside the Lucky 38 casino, managing his Securitron army through centuries of patient planning and technological maintenance, represented a form of institutional persistence that even the Brotherhood, old as it was, could not claim to match in the specific terms of single-location continuity. The Securitrons that his network commanded were not individually capable of matching Brotherhood soldiers in direct engagement. Their number, their coordination, and the infrastructure behind them gave the Lucky 38's occupant a form of local dominance that military force alone did not simply override. The Brotherhood operating in the New Vegas territory held enough capability to be significant in every engagement it chose to enter. It did not hold enough to treat the city's existing power structure as something it could dismantle through the same direct approach that had worked in the Commonwealth against the Institute. The positioning required identifying leverage points, developing intelligence, determining where the chapter's specific advantages were most applicable, was the work of an organization that was powerful and constrained simultaneously, which was, by 2296, an accurate description of the Brotherhood across most of the territory it operated in. The communities that the Brotherhood's patrols moved through in the Los Angeles territory experienced the organization's presence through a perspective that the Brotherhood's own institutional documentation did not capture, and had never been designed to capture. A settlement that watched Brotherhood paladins move through its territory without stopping registered the passage as a fact about its own security situation, information about what the armored organization operating in the area considered worth its attention and what it did not, a calibration of how the settlement existed relative to the chapter's priorities. A community that had pre-war technology in its possession and that had learned through experience or through the experience of communities near it that the Brotherhood's interest in that technology did not include leaving it in. Place understood the organization's patrols as a form of ongoing assessment rather than protection. The discipline that Brotherhood soldiers maintained in the field, the professionalism, the adherence to command authority, the absence of the random violence that raider groups produced was real and was not nothing. People who had lived in territory where armed groups operated without the constraints of institutional discipline understood the difference between that and what the Brotherhood's soldiers represented. The distinction was meaningful. It was not sufficient to make the Brotherhood's presence feel like safety to communities that had no path into the organization and no reliable protection if the chapter decided their resources were worth taking. 2.5 centuries of decisions had produced an institution that was genuinely capable and genuinely limited by the same philosophy that had made it capable. The founding principle that technology should be held by those qualified to manage it, had produced an organization powerful enough to shape the wasteland, and committed enough to its own framework that it could not see the wasteland clearly from inside that framework. The ruins of Los Angeles spread around the chapter's positions in every direction, the remains of a city that had been one of the largest in the pre-war world, transformed by the exchange and the years after it into something that bore the shape of what it had been without the content. The Brotherhood moved through those ruins with the confidence of an organization that had survived everything the post-war world had produced for 2.5 centuries. What the ruins thought of that confidence was not something the Brotherhood had ever developed a reliable method for determining.